Alden Merriweather had been driving 18-wheelers through Midwest winters for the better part of 2 decades, and he'd learned to read snow the way sailors read waves. Tonight's blizzard came down hard and mean across Wisconsin's I-94 corridor, the kind of whiteout that turned highway markers into ghosts and reduced visibility to the reach of your high beams. His 2019 Freightliner Cascadia pushed through accumulating drifts with the steady determination of a plow horse. Reefer unit chattering behind the cab as it worked to keep 42,000 pounds of frozen seafood at precisely 18 degrees Fahrenheit. The load was bound for a distributor in Minneapolis, and Alden had maybe 3 hours to cover the remaining 160 miles before his 14-hour window expired, and federal law forced him off the road for a mandatory 10-hour break. The CB radio crackled with sparse chatter, mostly other drivers reporting conditions and warning about accidents that had shut down the eastbound lanes near Madison. Alden kept his speed steady at 45, following the twin red smears of taillights from a cattle hauler about 200 yards ahead. Behind him, nothing but darkness, and the occasional sweep of headlights as another rig materialized from the storm. The Wisconsin DOT had issued a no unnecessary travel advisory 2 hours ago, but freight didn't care about advisories. Grocery stores needed their seafood deliveries, and companies didn't pay detention fees for weather delays unless you could prove the roads were officially closed. So Alden drove, hands loose on the wheel, eyes scanning for black ice and the telltale shimmer that warned of invisible hazards lurking beneath fresh powder. Around mile marker 207, just east of Mauston, the cattle hauler's brake lights flared bright and urgent. Alden eased off the throttle, engine brake growling as the Cascadia lost momentum. Ahead, orange construction barrels funneled traffic into a single lane, and beyond them, the blue and white sign for a way station emerged from the blowing snow like a bureaucratic apparition. Wisconsin's scales usually went dormant during severe weather, but the overhead sign showed green, indicating the station was open and commercial vehicles were required to pull in for weighing and possible inspection. Alden downshifted and followed the cattle hauler onto the ramp, tires crunching through 6 inches of fresh accumulation that the state plows hadn't touched yet. The weigh station sat in a shallow bowl carved from frozen farmland, surrounded by empty fields that stretched to invisible horizons. Sodium vapor lights cast sickly yellow pools across the approach lanes, and the scale house itself looked like a concrete bunker designed to survive whatever winter could throw at it. But something felt wrong the moment Alden cleared the entrance. The scale platform sat empty, no vehicles queued for weighing, no DOT inspectors visible through the scale house windows. The cattle hauler that had been ahead of him was nowhere in sight, vanished as completely as if it had never existed. Alden keyed his CB radio, trying to raise the other driver, but received only static in response. The emergency channel was equally dead, just white noise and the occasional burst of interference that might have been NOAA weather broadcasts fragmenting through atmospheric distortion. He rolled slowly toward the scale platform, watching for any sign of personnel or instructions. The building's windows glowed with interior light, but the glass was frosted over with ice crystals that made it impossible to see inside. A hand-lettered sign hung on the scale house door, visible in his headlights as he approached. The paper looked official enough, printed on what appeared to be state letterhead, but the message made his stomach tighten with unease. Scale closed due to equipment malfunction. All commercial vehicles proceed to County Road MM for alternate routing. Failure to comply subject to citation. The signature at the bottom was illegible, just a scrawled mark that could have been anything, and there was no official stamp or seal to verify authenticity. Alden had been through this weigh station maybe 50 times over the years, and he'd never seen it close for equipment problems during operating hours. The state maintained these facilities with paranoid precision because scale revenue helped fund highway infrastructure. Closing a station meant lost income and potential lawsuits from trucking companies whose drivers got delayed. But the sign looked legitimate, and county detours weren't unusual when main routes became impassable. He grabbed his atlas from the passenger seat and flipped to the Wisconsin page, tracing County Road MM with his finger. The route existed, running parallel to I-94 about 10 miles north before reconnecting near Tomah. It would add maybe 20 minutes to his drive, but that was preferable to sitting here waiting for a scale operator who might not show up for hours. The CB radio crackled suddenly, a burst of voice so quick and distorted that Alden couldn't make out the words. He adjusted the squelch and tried again. Breaker 19, westbound Cascadia at the Mostyn Scales. Anybody copy? Static answered, but underneath it, he thought he heard something else. A voice repeating the same message he'd just read on the sign, the exact same phrasing about equipment malfunction in County Road MM. But the voice had a flat, mechanical quality that reminded him of old answering machines, and it cut off mid-sentence as if someone had yanked the power cord. Alden's hands were sweating inside his insulated gloves despite the cold. 20 years of winter driving had taught him that strange behavior during blizzards usually had logical explanations. CB radios picked up weird interference from atmospheric conditions. NOAA repeaters sometimes broadcast outdated messages, and stressed equipment did malfunction when temperatures dropped below zero. He put the Cascadia in gear and followed the signs pointing toward the County Road detour, leaving the empty way station behind. The exit ramp curved away from I-94, descending into darkness that seemed thicker than natural night. His headlights carved tunnels through falling snow, revealing a two-lane road that hadn't been plowed in hours. Drifts reached halfway up his drive tires, and the pavement underneath felt wrong, too smooth and slick to be standard Wisconsin blacktop. Alden downshifted to third gear, letting the engine brake control his speed as the Cascadia wallowed through accumulation that grew deeper with every 100 yards. Behind him, his trailer swayed gently, the load shifting slightly as frozen seafood boxes pressed against their restraints. He checked his mirrors compulsively but saw only his own marker lights reflecting off walls of white. County Road MM wound through farmland that looked abandoned. No house lights visible. No other vehicles sharing the road. The GPS unit on his dashboard flickered and died, the screen going black before rebooting with an error message about lost satellite signal. That wasn't unusual in severe weather when heavy cloud cover blocked transmission, but the timing felt deliberate, as if something wanted him disconnected from external navigation. Alden relied on his atlas now, matching the road's curves to the printed map and estimating distance by elapsed time and average speed. 20 minutes became 30, then 40, and still no sign of the reconnection point where County Road MM was supposed to merge back with I-94. The road seemed to be leading him deeper into wilderness, rather than parallel to the interstate. The CB radio came alive again, this time with crystal clarity. "Westbound Cascadia. You're on the wrong route. Turn around immediately." The voice was male, authoritative, sounding like a DOT inspector or highway patrol officer. But there was something off about the cadence, words delivered too evenly, with no natural rhythm or inflection. Alden keyed his mic. "Copy that. Can you provide directions to I-94? GPS is down and I've been following county road signs." Silence as stretched for 10 seconds, then the voice returned. "Turn around immediately. You're on the wrong route." Exactly the same words, same tone, same mechanical delivery. A recording, Alden realized. Someone was playing a recorded message on the emergency channel, probably trying to spook drivers into making mistakes. Up ahead, maybe half a mile through the storm, he spotted lights. Not the warm glow of a farmhouse or the harsh white of commercial flood lamps, but something in between. amber and pulsing, like emergency flashers from a disabled vehicle. Alden eased off the throttle, approaching cautiously. As he got closer, the lights resolved into a scene that made no sense. The way station, the exact same facility he'd left 40 minutes ago, sat beside the road as if it had always been there. Same concrete bunker design, same yellow sodium vapor lights, same hand-lettered sign hanging on the door. But that was impossible. He'd driven west continuously, following county road signs that should have led him away from the station's location. There was no way he could have circled back without noticing. He stopped the Cascadia 50 yards from the building and set the parking brake, engine idling roughly in the cold. Something was very wrong, and 2 decades of experience screamed at him to get back to I-94 by any means necessary. But the storm had intensified while he'd been driving, snow falling so thick now that his wipers struggled to keep the windshield clear. Visibility was down to maybe 20 feet, and attempting to navigate blind through drifts that could swallow his truck entirely seemed like suicide. The way station offered shelter at least, and maybe a working phone to call dispatch for guidance. Alden grabbed his flashlight and emergency radio, then climbed down into wind that hit like a physical assault. The walk to the scale house door took 5 minutes, each step a battle against snow that reached his knees and wind that tried to knock him sideways. His flashlight beam barely penetrated the blizzard, showing only swirling white chaos punctuated by the building's bulk. The door was unlocked, which struck him as odd for a closed facility, but he pushed inside gratefully, escaping the wind's relentless assault. The interior was warmer than outside, but not by much, maybe 45 degrees Fahrenheit, as if the heating system had been running at minimum capacity for hours. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh illumination across a space that looked simultaneously modern and abandoned. The scalehouse reception area held the usual equipment: computer terminals for processing vehicle weights and inspections, filing cabinets stuffed with paperwork, coffee maker with a half-full pot that had turned to sludge. But everything was covered with a thin layer of dust, undisturbed by recent human activity. Alden called out, "Hello? Anybody here? I need to report road conditions and request guidance." His voice echoed strangely, as if the walls absorbed sound rather than reflecting it naturally. No one answered. He walked deeper into the facility, flashlight sweeping across empty offices and break rooms where personal belongings sat exactly as if employees had stepped out for a moment and never returned. In the main scale control room, Alden found something that made his throat constrict. Papers scattered across the desk, dozens of scale tickets printed and dated, but not from tonight. These receipts were dated 3 weeks in the future, showing vehicles that hadn't been weighed yet, drivers whose names he didn't recognize. The timestamps were equally impossible, listing weights recorded at times that hadn't occurred yet. February 17th, 0315, February 19th, 2247, February 22nd, 1603. Alden flipped through the stack, hands shaking as he realized every single ticket was dated between 2 and 4 weeks from tonight's date. Someone had printed an entire month's worth of fake documentation, or the equipment was malfunctioning in ways that violated basic physics. The CB radio on the control room desk crackled to life, and this time the voice was different, female, older, with the weary patience of a dispatcher who'd worked too many overnight shifts. "Attention, all westbound commercial traffic. Way station on I-94 mile marker 207 is experiencing equipment failures. All trucks are directed to County Road MM for alternate routing. This message will repeat." Then silence, followed by the exact same message again, word for word, same inflections, same pauses, looping endlessly like a recorded announcement. But the equipment wasn't playing a tape. The voice came through the CB's speaker with the characteristic static and compression of live transmission. Alden checked his watch. 1:17 a.m. He'd been off I-94 for over an hour now, and his load was approaching the temperature threshold where he'd need to either restore proper refrigeration or risk cargo damage. The reefer unit could run maybe another 3 hours on its independent diesel tank, but that assumed he'd be back on the highway and making progress. If he stayed stranded here, he'd face both cargo loss and violation of his hours of service limits. Neither option was acceptable. He needed to find a way back to I-94, storm or no storm, and get this load to Minneapolis before everything went wrong. That's when he heard the engine. Distant at first, then growing louder, the unmistakable diesel rumble of a heavy truck approaching the way station. Alden moved to the window and wiped away frost with his glove, peering out into the blizzard. Headlights materialized from the storm, attached to a white Peterbilt pulling a covered wagon trailer. The rig rolled slowly toward the scale platform, exactly as Alden had done earlier, following procedure even though the facility appeared closed. Relief flooded through him. Another driver meant potential assistance, someone with working GPS or satellite communication who could coordinate with dispatch for proper directions. He hurried outside, flashlight waving to catch the other driver's attention. The Peterbilt stopped on the scale platform, air brakes hissing, and the driver's door opened. A figure climbed down, bundled in winter gear that obscured any identifying features. Alden called out over the wind. "Hey, driver, you know how to get back to 94 from here? I've been following county road signs for over an hour and ended up back where I started." The figure turned toward him, and even through the blowing snow, Alden could see that something was profoundly wrong. The person moved with mechanical precision, each step identical in length and timing, arms swinging at unnatural angles. As they got closer, Alden's flashlight beam caught details that made him back away instinctively. The face was wrong, not disfigured or injured, but wrong in ways his brain struggled to process. Features that were almost human but not quite, as if someone had described a person to an artist who'd never actually seen one. Eyes that reflected his flashlight beam like an animal's, showing a greenish glow that human eyes didn't produce. Skin that had the waxy texture of cheap mannequins. The figure stopped 10 feet away and spoke in the same mechanical voice he'd heard on the CB radio. "Turn around immediately, you're on the wrong route." Then it stood motionless, waiting for a response it couldn't process. Alden ran. No thought, no planning, just pure survival instinct driving him back toward his Cascadia through snow that seemed to clutch at his legs like frozen hands. Behind him, he heard nothing. No pursuit, no shouts, just the wind and his own ragged breathing. He reached the truck and hauled himself into the cab, slamming the door and engaging the locks with trembling fingers. The Cascadia's engine fired immediately, turbo-spooling as he threw the transmission into reverse and backed away from the way station without bothering to check his mirrors. The building vanished into the storm within seconds, swallowed by white chaos that erased its existence completely. He found pavement that felt like real highway, solid and properly maintained, and followed it west with desperate hope that it would lead somewhere recognizable. The CB radio stayed silent now. No more recorded messages, no more mechanical voices. Just static and the occasional burst of legitimate traffic from other drivers who sounded blessedly normal. 20 minutes later, a green sign emerged from the storm. I-94 west 2 miles. Alden could have wept with relief. He merged onto the interstate and immediately recognized familiar landmarks, the same stretch of highway he'd been traveling before the detour. Behind him, County Road MM and its impossible way station existed only in memory, and the stack of future-dated scale tickets he'd stuffed into his jacket pocket as evidence of something he'd never be able to explain. Alden kept the Cascadia at 60 miles per hour despite the blizzard conditions, needing distance between himself and whatever he'd encountered at that way station more than he needed safety. His hands gripped the steering wheel hard enough to make his knuckles ache, and every few seconds he checked the mirrors compulsively, searching for headlights that might indicate pursuit. The interstate stretched empty behind him, just his own marker lights reflecting off falling snow and the occasional glimpse of reflective mile markers. His breath came in shallow gasps that fogged the windshield faster than the defroster could clear it, and he realized he was operating on pure adrenaline, the kind of panic-driven state that led to mistakes and accidents. He forced himself to ease off the throttle, bringing his speed down to a more manageable 45, and focused on the mechanics of driving. Scan mirrors, check gauges, maintain lane position, watch for brake lights ahead. The repetitive tasks helped calm his racing thoughts enough to consider what he'd actually witnessed. A way station that appeared to be operating but showed no signs of recent human activity. Scale tickets dated weeks in the future, printed on equipment that should have been offline. A figure that moved and spoke like something pretending to be human but getting the details wrong. And most disturbing, the complete loop that had brought him back to the same location despite driving continuously west for over an hour. The CB radio crackled with normal traffic now, drivers reporting conditions and coordinates that matched reality. Eastbound at marker 230, black ice under the fresh powder, use caution. Westbound approaching Tama, right lane blocked by jackknifed trailer, emergency crews on scene. Anybody got road conditions west of Moston? Thinking about pulling off till this blows over. Real voices with natural inflection and regional accents blessed normalcy after the mechanical recordings that had guided him into nightmare territory. Alden keyed his mic, needing to hear his own voice contribute to the legitimate chatter. Westbound Cascadia just cleared Moston. Heavy accumulation, but roads passable if you keep your speed down and watch for drifts. A voice responded immediately, male, older, with the relaxed confidence of a veteran driver. Copy that, Cascadia. This your first run through a Wisconsin whiteout? Alden almost laughed at the question. Negative, driver. Been running these roads for 20 years. Tonight's just got me a little rattled. The other driver chuckled. Yeah, these storms'll do that. I've been driving 42 years and still get spooked when visibility drops to nothing. You running solo or you got a convoy? The question was innocent, just normal trucker conversation, but it reminded Alden how isolated he'd become during the detour. Solo, he admitted. Could use some company if you're headed west. I'm eastbound out of La Crosse, the voice replied. But I'll keep this channel open and monitor your progress. You got my back till you're clear of the weather. The simple offer of remote companionship steadied Alden more than he would have expected. This was the trucking community at its best, drivers looking out for each other across empty miles, providing reassurance through nothing more than radio contact. Appreciate that, driver. Westbound Cascadia. Handle is Merriweather if you need to reach me. Copy that, Merriweather. I'm rolling thunder out of La Crosse. You run into any trouble, you holler, and I'll relay to the Smokies. The exchange restored some equilibrium to Alden's shaken nerves. He was back on legitimate highway, surrounded by real drivers conducting real business, no longer trapped in whatever pocket of wrongness that way station represented. The reefer unit behind his cab continued its steady chatter, maintaining temperature despite the brutal cold, and his fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, plenty to reach Minneapolis without stopping. He could drive straight through, deliver his load on time, and file this experience under unexplained phenomena that happen sometimes on the road. Except he couldn't quite do that, because the stack of future-dated scale tickets in his jacket pocket proved he hadn't hallucinated the entire encounter. Around mile marker 240, Alden spotted the silhouette of a rest area sign emerging from the storm. The facility would be minimally maintained during blizzard conditions, but it offered bathrooms and vending machines, a chance to stretch his legs and splash water on his face. More importantly, it provided an opportunity to examine those scale tickets under proper lighting and decide whether they were real evidence or elaborate forgeries designed to mess with drivers' heads. He signaled right and eased onto the exit ramp, following the curve down to a parking area that held maybe 6 other commercial vehicles, all dark and buttoned up for the duration of the storm. The rest area building was a simple brick structure with harsh fluorescent lights and the institutional smell of industrial cleaner. Alden pushed through the main entrance and immediately felt the temperature differential, maybe 60 degrees inside compared to the sub-zero conditions outside. He stripped off his outer layers, hanging them on a wall hook, and headed for the men's room to perform the necessary biological functions that couldn't be delayed. The facilities were surprisingly clean for a highway rest stop during a winter storm, with paper products fully stocked and hand dryers that actually worked. He washed his hands and face with water so cold it made his teeth ache, then stood for a moment staring at his reflection in the scratched mirror above the sink. He looked like hell. 2 decades of night driving had carved lines around his eyes and mouth, and tonight's experience had added a haunted quality that made him appear 10 years older. His hands still trembled slightly when he held them under the dryer, autonomic response to fear that hadn't fully dissipated. He needed coffee and food, something to restore his blood sugar and help him think clearly about what to do next. The vending area held the usual selection of overpriced snacks and caffeine, and Alden fed bills into the machine until he'd accumulated a pile of candy bars, chips, and 2 bottles of high-octane energy drinks that promised to keep him alert for the remaining drive. He settled into one of the plastic chairs bolted to the floor and pulled out the scale tickets, spreading them across the small table. Under the rest area's unforgiving lights, the papers looked completely legitimate. Official Wisconsin DOT letterhead, computer-printed vehicle specifications, weight distributions broken down by axle. Everything formatted exactly the way genuine scale tickets appeared. But the dates were impossible. February 17th through February 22nd, all showing times and weights for trucks that hadn't been processed yet. Alden recognized some of the company names on the tickets, major carriers that ran regular routes through Wisconsin. He could theoretically contact these companies and ask if they had drivers scheduled to transit Boston during those dates, but what would that prove? One ticket in particular caught his attention. A Peterbilt registered to a company called Northern Star Logistics, weighed at 3:15 a.m. on February 17th, showing a gross weight of 79,800 pounds. Legal on all axles, no violations noted, cleared for travel. The receiving inspector's name was listed as J. Pennant, which Alden didn't recognize from his previous encounters with Wisconsin DOT personnel, but the disturbing detail was the notes section at the bottom of the ticket. In small print, barely visible under the harsh lighting, someone had written, "Driver reported disorientation and confusion regarding route. Advised to seek medical evaluation at next opportunity." Alden's stomach clenched. This wasn't just administrative documentation. Someone, or something, was predicting that future drivers would experience exactly what he'd gone through tonight. The disorientation, the impossible loop, the sense of being trapped in a location that defied normal geography. Either this was an elaborate hoax designed to target specific drivers, or the way station existed in some kind of temporal anomaly that affected multiple people across different dates. Neither explanation made rational sense, but one of them had to be true, because he was holding physical evidence that shouldn't exist. He pulled out his cell phone, which had regained signal now that he was back on the interstate corridor, and considered calling dispatch. The company would want to know about any unusual incidents during the run, especially ones that delayed delivery or raised safety concerns. But what could he possibly say that wouldn't sound like exhaustion-induced hallucination? I got detoured to a way station that trapped me in a time loop and produced scale tickets from the future. They'd order him off the road immediately and require a fitness for duty evaluation before letting him drive again. That meant lost income, black marks on his safety record, and the permanent stigma of being the driver who'd seen things that weren't there. The coffee was helping, hot and bitter enough to cut through his fatigue. Alden forced himself to think strategically rather than emotionally. He had 3 options. First, he could report everything to dispatch and accept whatever consequences came with that honesty. Second, he could destroy the scale tickets and pretend nothing unusual had happened, treating this as a weird experience best forgotten. Third, he could finish his delivery run and then investigate the way station during daylight hours when visibility was better and the storm had passed. The third option carried risks, but it was the only one that might provide actual answers about what he'd encountered. Before he could decide, the rest area door opened and another driver entered, stamping snow from his boots and muttering curses about the weather. The man was maybe 60, built like someone who'd spent decades loading and unloading freight before graduating to driving. He spotted Alden and nodded companionably. Hell of a night to be on the road. Alden agreed, watching as the other driver headed for the coffee machine. When he returned with a steaming cup, he settled into a chair across from Alden and gestured at the scattered scale tickets. Paperwork trouble? Alden made a split-second decision to trust his instincts. You ever run into anything strange at the Moston way station, around mile marker 207? The other driver's expression shifted, something flickering behind his eyes that might have been recognition or concern. Define strange. Alden chose his words carefully. Equipment malfunctions, confusing signage, maybe CB radio messages that didn't make sense. The driver was quiet for a long moment, sipping his coffee and studying Alden with the assessment of someone deciding whether to share information that might sound crazy. I'm Jory Pennant, the man finally said, and Alden's breath caught. The name from the scale ticket, the inspector who'd supposedly processed that future Peterbilt driver. Jory continued. I worked DOT enforcement for 15 years before I retired and went back to driving. That Moston station has a reputation, not official, nothing you'll find in company records, but drivers talk. Some of us have had experiences there that don't fit normal patterns. He leaned forward, lowering his voice even though they were alone in the rest area. I was working night shift maybe 8 years ago when we had a situation. Driver came through during a blizzard, got his weight ticket, proceeded on his route. Nothing unusual about the transaction. But 3 weeks later, that same driver showed up again with the same load, same truck, claiming it was his first time through our station. When we pulled his records, we had documentation of both visits, identical down to the axle weights. Alden felt cold that had nothing to do with the winter storm outside. What did you do? Jory shrugged. What could we do? Filed it as a clerical error. Assumed someone had duplicated paperwork. But I was the inspector on duty both times, and I remember both encounters clearly. Same conversation, same small talk about weather, same jokes. Like I was living the same interaction twice, separated by 3 weeks. He paused, then added, After I retired, I started asking around, quiet-like, talking to drivers who'd been through that station during severe weather. Found maybe a dozen who reported similar experiences, loops, disorientation, arriving at the station from directions that didn't make geographic sense. Did anyone figure out why? Alden asked, needing confirmation that he wasn't alone in experiencing this phenomenon. Jory shook his head. Best theory I heard came from a driver who used to be a physicist before he got into trucking. He talked about temporal distortions caused by extreme weather conditions interacting with electronic equipment. Something about how the scale's load cells and computer systems might create localized anomalies when temperatures and electromagnetic fields reached certain thresholds. It sounded like science fiction to me, but it was the only explanation that even attempted to address what people were experiencing. Alden showed Jory the stack of future-dated scale tickets. I found these tonight printed and sitting on the control room desk. Your name's on one of them. Jory examined the papers carefully, his expression growing more troubled with each page. "This is my signature stamp," he confirmed, "or a perfect forgery. But if these are legitimate documentation from the station's system, that means the phenomenon isn't just affecting drivers. It's affecting the equipment itself, processing transactions that haven't happened yet." He looked up at Alden with genuine concern. "You need to report this to someone with authority to investigate. Not just company dispatch, but maybe state police or DOT administration." "And tell them what?" Alden asked, frustration bleeding into his voice. "That I got trapped in a time loop and found evidence of future events. They'll pull me off the road faster than I can finish explaining." Jory acknowledged the point with a grimace. "Fair enough. But you can't just ignore this. If that station is genuinely malfunctioning in ways that affect driver safety, it needs to be shut down and investigated. People could get hurt, or worse, if the anomalies become more severe." He stood, draining the last of his coffee. "I've got a friend who works for the State Transportation Department, someone who might be willing to listen without immediately assuming we're crazy. Let me make some calls in the morning, see if we can get someone to take this seriously." Alden felt some of the weight lift from his shoulders. Having another person, especially a former DOT inspector, corroborate the way station's strange behavior made this feel less like personal delusion and more like legitimate phenomenon that deserved investigation. "I appreciate that," he said sincerely. "Meanwhile, I need to finish this run and get my load delivered. Can't afford detention penalties on top of everything else." Jory nodded understanding. "You got my CB handle if you need anything. Rolling Thunder, usually monitor Channel 19. And Merriweather, be careful out there. Whatever's happening at that station, it's not bound by normal rules. Don't assume you understand the limits of what it can do." The warning settled into Alden's bones as he gathered his trash and prepared to return to the storm. He'd spent 20 years on these roads believing he understood the risks, the variables that could turn a routine run into disaster. Mechanical failures, weather hazards, driver fatigue, all quantifiable dangers that could be managed through preparation and experience. But this was different. A threat that operated outside physical laws, creating situations where your location and time became uncertain. How did you prepare for that? How did you manage risks when geography itself became unreliable? Back in the Cascadia, Alden fired the engine and watched gauges climb to normal operating parameters. The reefer unit continued its faithful service, keeping his seafood load at proper temperature despite the hours of stress and deviation from planned route. His GPS had restored satellite lock, showing his current position and the remaining distance to Minneapolis with reassuring precision. Everything appeared normal, functional, ready to complete the delivery as contracted. But Alden knew that appearance was deceptive, that beneath the surface of routine commerce, something profoundly wrong was occurring at certain facilities during certain conditions. He pulled back onto I-94 westbound, merging into light traffic consisting mostly of other commercial vehicles whose drivers had decided the freight was worth risking the storm. The CB chatter continued its normal patterns, weather reports and traffic updates, delivered in the casual shorthand that truckers use to compress information into efficient transmissions. Alden listened without contributing, letting the familiar voices provide background comfort while his mind worked through the implications of what Jory had told him. If the Mostyn Way station had been experiencing anomalies for at least 8 years, That meant dozens or potentially hundreds of drivers had encountered similar phenomena. Why hadn't this become public knowledge? Why weren't there investigations, news reports, official closures? The answer, Alden realized, was the same reason he'd been reluctant to report his own experience. Truck drivers operated in a professional environment that valued reliability and stability above almost everything else. Admitting to strange experiences, especially ones that couldn't be objectively verified, risked your reputation and livelihood. Better to keep quiet, chalk it up to fatigue or stress, and hope it didn't happen again. That collective silence allowed the phenomenon to continue unchallenged, affecting new drivers who had no warning about what they might encounter. It was a conspiracy of embarrassment rather than malice, but the effect was the same. The way station continued operating, and drivers continued falling into its temporal traps. Milwaukee's distant glow appeared on the horizon, sodium vapor haze reflecting off low clouds to create a dome of artificial daylight. Alden would skirt the city's southern edge, avoiding the worst of urban traffic, and continue northwest toward Minneapolis. Another 3 hours if weather permitted, 4 if the storm intensified. His 14-hour window would expire around 6 a.m., giving him narrow margin to complete delivery before federal hours of service regulations forced him offline. But for the first time tonight, Alden felt confident he'd make it. He was back on real roads, surrounded by real traffic, connected to legitimate communication networks that operated according to physical laws he understood. The scale tickets remained in his jacket pocket, physical evidence of something that defied rational explanation. Tomorrow, after he'd slept and restored his mental equilibrium, he'd decide what to do with them. Maybe contact Jory's friend in the transportation department. Maybe find a way to anonymously report the way station's malfunctions. Maybe just document everything and store it away as insurance against future encounters. But tonight, his only job was to drive, to keep this load moving forward through winter darkness, and to remember that sometimes the road revealed mysteries that couldn't be solved, only survived and noted for future travelers who might need the warning. The Minneapolis distribution center materialized from pre-dawn darkness like a fortress of commerce, its loading docks lit by flood lamps that turned falling snow into cascading diamonds. Alden guided the Cascadia through the security gate at 5:40 a.m., exactly 20 minutes before his hours of service window expired, and felt the tension drain from his shoulders as he backed into Dock 7. The delivery had cost him 4 hours of detour and psychological torment, but the load itself remained intact. Temperature logs showing the reefer unit had maintained perfect conditions throughout the nightmare journey. That counted as success in the freight business, where cargo condition mattered more than driver comfort or unexplained phenomena encountered along the route. The dock workers were efficient and professional, unloading 42,000 pounds of frozen seafood with the practiced speed of men who'd done this 10,000 times before. Alden completed his paperwork, collected his bills of lading stamped with receiving signatures, and logged off-duty for the mandatory 10-hour break. The company maintained a driver lounge with bunks for exactly this situation, and Alden intended to use every minute of that break to sleep away the accumulated stress. But first, he needed to make a call while the events were still fresh in his memory, and before his exhausted brain convinced him that fatigue had manufactured the entire experience. He found a quiet corner of the lounge and dialed dispatch, reaching the night supervisor who'd coordinated his load assignment. The woman answered with the brisk efficiency of someone managing 30 drivers across 6 states. "Merriweather, good timing. I was about to ping you for status update. Load delivered?" Alden confirmed delivery and provided the dock signature codes, then carefully broached the subject of his detour. "I need to report unusual conditions at the Moston Way Station, mile marker 207 on I-94. Station appeared closed with signage directing trucks to County Road Detour. Followed signs for over an hour before realizing the route was circular. Eventually, found my way back to the interstate but lost significant time. The supervisor was quiet for a moment, keyboard clicking as she pulled up route information. Mauston scales show operational status in the system, no closures or maintenance notices filed. Are you saying the signage was incorrect? Alden chose his words carefully, aware that this conversation would be recorded and potentially reviewed if the company faced liability issues. I'm saying the situation didn't match official records. Whether that's due to outdated signage, communication failures between DOT and your dispatch system, or something else, I can't determine. But drivers should be aware that detour instructions at that location may not be reliable, especially during severe weather. Noted, the supervisor replied, making the word sound like she was filing this under driver complaints that probably resulted from stress and poor visibility. I'll forward your report to Safety Department and request clarification from Wisconsin DOT. Meanwhile, you're logged off for 10 hours. Get some rest and we'll have another load lined up for you this afternoon. The call ended with professional pleasantries that felt hollow given what Alden had experienced. He'd done his duty by reporting the incident, but he could tell the company wasn't taking it seriously. That meant other drivers would continue using that route without warning, potentially falling into the same trap he'd escaped. Sleep came hard despite his exhaustion, his mind replaying the encounter with the mechanical figure and the impossible loop that had brought him back to the starting point. When he finally drifted off, his dreams were filled with endless snow and roads that curved back on themselves like Mobius strips, trapping him in geometric impossibilities where every direction led to the same destination. He woke 4 hours later, sweating despite the cool temperature of the bunk room, and knew he wouldn't be able to rest properly until he understood what had happened at that way station. Alden spent the remaining break hours researching everything he could find about the Mauston facility. The Wisconsin DOT website listed it as a standard inspection station, operational since 1973, processing an average of 1,200 commercial vehicles per day. Maintenance records showed routine upkeep and equipment calibrations, nothing suggesting chronic problems or unusual malfunctions. But when he expanded his search to trucker forums and CB radio communities, a different picture emerged. Scattered posts across multiple platforms mentioned strange experiences at Mauston during winter storms. Drivers reporting disorientation, unexpected detours, and the sensation of time passing differently than their onboard clocks indicated. Most posts were quickly dismissed by other forum members as fatigue-induced confusion or weather-related stress, but the pattern was unmistakable once you knew to look for it. Every 6 to 8 weeks during winter months, someone reported an anomalous experience at that location. The frequency suggested this wasn't random hallucination, but something consistent and predictable, occurring under specific conditions that combined severe weather with nighttime operations. Alden cross-referenced the dates from his future-dated scale tickets with the forum posts and found something chilling. Several of the dates matched exactly with predicted storm systems according to extended weather forecasts. Someone, or something, was anticipating which nights would produce the conditions necessary for the phenomenon to manifest. His phone buzzed with a text message from Jory Pennant. Called my contact at State Transportation. She's interested but needs more than anecdotal reports. Can you meet me at a truck stop in Wisconsin Dells tomorrow morning? Bring those scale tickets. We might have enough evidence to trigger an official investigation. Alden replied affirmatively and felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Moving this from personal nightmare to official inquiry meant validation that he wasn't crazy, but it also meant deeper involvement with something that clearly operated outside normal boundaries. Still, if there was a chance to protect other drivers from experiencing what he'd gone through, the risk was worth taking. The afternoon load assignment took Alden northeast toward Green Bay with a trailer full of automotive parts, a routine run that should have felt mundane after the previous night's trauma. But he found himself hyper-aware of every road sign and exit marker, checking his GPS compulsively to ensure he remained on the planned route. The winter storm had passed, leaving behind crystalline skies and temperatures that plunged to 10 below zero. The roads were clear, traffic was light, and nothing about the drive suggested any possibility of unusual events. Yet Alden couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, tracking his movements through mechanisms he couldn't identify. Around 4 p.m., his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He answered using the hands-free system, expecting either a spam call or company dispatch with route modifications. Instead, he heard a woman's voice, professional and direct. "Is this Alden Merriweather, the driver who filed a report about Mostyn Way Station?" Alden confirmed his identity cautiously. The woman introduced herself as Maeve Reddick, investigator with the Wisconsin DOT's Safety Compliance Division. "Jory Pennant contacted me about your experience last night. I'd like to ask you some questions, if you have time to talk while you're driving." Alden's pulse quickened. An actual investigator, not just a sympathetic former inspector, but someone with authority to access official records and mandate facility inspections. "Yes, ma'am, I can talk. What do you need to know?" Maeve's questions were methodical and detailed, covering everything from the exact time he'd entered the way station to specific wording on the detour signage. She asked about weather conditions, visibility estimates, other vehicles he'd observed, and the mechanical voice on the CB radio. Her tone remained neutral throughout, neither dismissive nor overly credulous, just gathering information with professional thoroughness. When Alden described finding the future-dated scale tickets, Maeve went silent for several seconds. "You're certain about those dates? Not just misprinted or displaying wrong year due to computer error?" Alden had anticipated the question and provided specific details. "I have the tickets with me, multiple dates ranging from February 17th through 22nd, all with complete vehicle information and your department's official formatting. I can photograph them and send the images if that would help." Maeve agreed immediately, providing an email address for secure document transmission. "Do that as soon as you're safely stopped. And Mr. Merriweather, I need you to understand something. What you're describing isn't just unusual, it's potentially evidence of criminal activity." The statement hit Alden like cold water. Criminal activity? I thought we were dealing with equipment malfunction or some kind of temporal anomaly. Maeve's laugh was short and humorless. "Temporal anomalies aren't in my jurisdiction, but fraudulent documentation, unauthorized use of state facilities, and possible robbery schemes targeting commercial drivers definitely are. Those scale tickets you found might be part of a sophisticated operation that's been using weather conditions and driver vulnerability to commit theft or worse. We've had reports, unconfirmed until now, about trucks disappearing in that area during blizzards, loads never delivered, drivers never reaching their destinations, entire rigs vanishing as if they'd never existed." Alden felt his chest constrict. He'd been thinking about this in terms of weird phenomenon, an unsolved mystery that defied explanation but didn't necessarily threaten physical safety. But if Maeve was right, the way station wasn't just malfunctioning. It was being used as bait in a trap designed to isolate and victimize commercial drivers during conditions when help would be hours away and visibility made investigation nearly impossible. "What kind of theft are we talking about?" he asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. "High-value cargo primarily," Maeve explained. "Electronics, pharmaceuticals, anything that can be quickly fenced through black market channels. The pattern suggests they monitor CB radio traffic and DOT databases to identify valuable loads. then use the fake closure signs to divert drivers onto county roads where accomplices can intercept them away from the main highway. The future dated scale tickets might be part of their planning process, documenting which trucks they intend to target on upcoming nights based on weather forecasts and shipping schedules. It's actually quite sophisticated if our theory is correct. Alden thought about the mechanical figure he'd encountered, the one that moved with inhuman precision and spoke in recorded phrases. "I saw someone at the station," or something that looked like a person but moved wrong. Could that have been part of the operation? Maeve's response was immediate and sharp. "Describe exactly what you saw. Every detail you remember." Alden walked through the encounter, from the approaching Peterbilt to the figure that climbed out and spoke in mechanical repetitions. When he finished, Maeve was quiet for a long moment. "Mr. Merriweather, I think you encountered what we call a distraction agent. Some criminal operations use individuals with specific training or, in rare cases, people who've been drugged or coerced into behaving in ways that seem inhuman. The goal is to terrify the target, make them panic and flee, which often leads them directly into the secondary trap where the actual robbery occurs. You were lucky. By running back to your truck and escaping before they could complete their setup, you avoided becoming another missing driver statistic." The explanation made horrible sense, transforming supernatural terror into calculated human cruelty. Someone had been watching him, hurting him through carefully constructed scenarios designed to maximize fear and confusion. "What do you need from me?" Alden asked, anger replacing fear now that he understood the threat was human rather than otherworldly. Maeve's answer was exactly what he'd hoped to hear. "Everything. Your testimony, those scale tickets, detailed timeline of your movements, any photographs or video your truck's dash camera might have captured. We're going to build a case that will let us shut down that operation permanently and prosecute everyone involved. But I need you to be willing to go on record, possibly testify in court if this leads to arrests. Can you commit to that?" Alden didn't hesitate. "Absolutely. Whatever it takes to make sure other drivers don't go through what I experienced." They arranged to meet the following morning at the truck stop Jory had suggested, where Maeve would collect evidence and take formal statements. The call ended with Maeve's warning to stay alert and report any indication that he was being followed or monitored. "If this is an organized operation, they might have observed your escape and identified you as a potential threat to their business. Be careful, trust your instincts, and don't hesitate to call 911 if anything feels wrong." The rest of the drive to Green Bay passed without incident, but Alden found himself checking mirrors obsessively and noting the make and model of every vehicle that maintained position near his truck for more than a few miles. The paranoia was probably excessive, but Maeve's warning had transformed his understanding of the previous night. He hadn't stumbled into mysterious temporal phenomenon. He'd been targeted by criminals sophisticated enough to use weather, technology, and psychological manipulation to rob and possibly harm commercial drivers. The scale tickets weren't evidence of time travel. They were a planning document, a hit list of future victims selected based on cargo value and vulnerability. That night, parked at the Green Bay Distribution Center after completing his delivery, Alden photographed every scale ticket from multiple angles under bright lighting. He captured the Wisconsin DOT letterhead, the future dates, the vehicle specifications, and especially the notes section that referenced driver disorientation. Each image was uploaded to secure cloud storage and emailed to Maeve's address as promised. Then he sealed the original documents in a plastic bag and locked them in his truck's safe, evidence that might help dismantle a criminal enterprise that had been preying on truckers for who knew how many years. Sleep came easier that night, though Alden's dreams were still troubled by memories of endless snow and mechanical figures. But the fear had transformed into something more manageable now that he understood the threat's true nature. Criminals could be caught, operations could be shut down, and drivers could be warned about specific tactics and locations. The road held plenty of real dangers without needing to invoke the supernatural. Human predators were more than sufficient to fill the darkness with threats that required vigilance and community cooperation to overcome. Morning found Alden driving south toward Wisconsin Dells, where he'd meet Jory and Maeve at a truck stop that catered to the commercial traffic flowing through the interstate corridor. The facility was large and well-maintained, with separate parking for law enforcement and emergency vehicles. Alden spotted Maeve immediately, a woman in her early 40s wearing a DOT inspector's jacket and carrying a tablet computer that probably contained years of investigation files. Jory stood beside her, and together they looked like exactly what they were: professionals determined to solve a problem that had persisted too long in the shadows. The interview took 2 hours, with Maeve recording every word while taking notes on her tablet. She asked Alden to walk through the experience multiple times, each iteration focusing on different details: times, locations, exact wording of signs and CB transmissions, physical descriptions of the figure he'd encountered, mechanical specifications of the Peterbilt that had approached the way station. Some questions seemed irrelevant until Maeve explained how each detail might connect to other reports or help identify patterns in the criminal operations methodology. When Alden produced the scale tickets, Maeve's expression shifted to something between satisfaction and concern. She photographed each document, then examined them under a portable ultraviolet light that revealed watermarks and security features invisible to normal vision. "These are genuine Wisconsin DOT forms," she confirmed. "Not forgeries or printouts from downloaded templates. That means whoever created them had access to our restricted supply chain, probably through a corrupt employee or a sophisticated theft from one of our facilities. This just became a much bigger investigation than I initially thought." Jory had been quiet through most of the interview, but now he spoke up. "How many drivers do you think they've targeted successfully? The ones who didn't escape like Alden did?" Maeve's face darkened. "We have 7 missing truck reports from that corridor over the past 3 winters. Drivers who entered the area during blizzard conditions and simply vanished. No bodies found, no abandoned vehicles, no cargo recovered. Their companies filed insurance claims and moved on, treating them as tragic accidents where the drivers probably went off-road in poor visibility and haven't been discovered yet. But if your theory is correct, those drivers were intercepted by this operation and either killed or forced to abandon their vehicles, which were then stripped and sold through criminal networks." The number hit Alden like a physical blow. 7 drivers, 7 families wondering what happened to their loved ones, 7 loads of cargo stolen, and an unknown amount of money flowing to criminals who'd perfected their predatory system over multiple years. "What happens now?" he asked, needing to know that this information would lead to action rather than just adding to a file that gathered dust in some bureaucratic archive. Maeve's smile was grim but determined. "Now we set a trap of our own. We use your testimony and these scale tickets to get warrants for surveillance equipment at the way station. We coordinate with state police to establish undercover presence during the next predicted blizzard. And we catch these people in the act, document their operation, and build cases that will put them away for decades." She stood, offering her hand to Alden. "You did the right thing coming forward. A lot of drivers would have tried to forget what happened and avoid making waves. Because of your courage and willingness to trust that someone would listen, we have a real chance to shut down an operation that's been killing people for years." 3 weeks passed before Maeve contacted Alden again, and during that time he'd driven nearly 8,000 miles through 7 states, delivering everything from frozen food to industrial machinery. Every load felt routine compared to that night at the Mostyn Way station, but the experience had changed something fundamental in how he approached the job. He varied his routes now, avoiding predictable patterns, and he monitored weather forecasts with obsessive attention, planning his trips to minimize exposure to severe conditions. The freedom and independence that had initially attracted him to trucking had been replaced by constant vigilance, the awareness that roads he'd trusted for 2 decades might harbor traps designed by people who understood driver psychology well enough to exploit it. Maeve's call came on a Tuesday afternoon while Alden was fueling at a truck stop outside of Des Moines. "We have movement," she said without preamble. "Weather Service is predicting a major blizzard system moving through central Wisconsin tomorrow night, conditions nearly identical to what you experienced. We've established surveillance around the Mostyn station and we have assets in place, but I need to ask you something, and you're free to refuse without any judgment." Alden felt his stomach tighten with anticipation. "What do you need?" "We need bait," Maeve explained. "A legitimate, high-value load that will attract their attention and give us probable cause to intercept when they make their move. You've already proven you can handle the psychological pressure, and you know their tactics. If you're willing to run another load through that corridor during the storm, with full law enforcement support and tracking, we can catch them in the act." The request should have terrified him, but instead Alden felt a strange calm settle over his thoughts. This was an opportunity to transform his victimization into action, to help ensure that the 7 missing drivers and however many other targets hadn't suffered for nothing. "What's the load?" he asked, already knowing he'd accept regardless of the cargo. Maeve's relief was audible. Electronics, high-end computer equipment worth about $3 million. Legitimate shipment from a manufacturer in Illinois to a distribution center in Minneapolis, same route you ran 3 weeks ago. The company's cooperating fully and understands the risks. We'll have unmarked vehicles tracking you from the moment you enter Wisconsin, and we've positioned tactical teams at multiple points along I-94. If they take the bait, we'll have them boxed in with no escape routes. The plan was solid, backed by resources and personnel that individual drivers could never access. But Alden knew from experience that plans rarely survived contact with reality, especially when dealing with criminals sophisticated enough to have operated successfully for years. What if they recognize me? My truck, my face, anything that marks me as the driver who got away? Maeve had anticipated the concern. "We're putting you in a rental rig, unmarked cab with temporary plates. You'll be using a different CB handle, and we'll have altered your load documentation to show a fictional company. As far as they know, you're just another driver hauling valuable cargo through bad weather." Alden agreed to the operation and spent the following day preparing mentally for what would essentially be a law enforcement sting with him as the lure. The Illinois pickup went smoothly, loading dock workers securing $3 million worth of computer equipment into a 53-foot dry van trailer that was then sealed with tamper-evident locks and GPS tracking devices hidden in multiple locations. The rental truck was a 2021 Kenworth T680, newer and better equipped than his usual Cascadia, with communication systems that included encrypted channels linking him directly to Maeve's command post. He rolled out of the shipping facility at 4 p.m., giving him plenty of time to reach the critical corridor before the blizzard intensified. The weather forecast had been refined throughout the day, and meteorologists were now predicting whiteout conditions across central Wisconsin starting around 10 p.m. and continuing through dawn. Perfect conditions for the criminal operation to attempt another interdiction, assuming they monitored weather as carefully as Maeve believed. The drive north was uneventful, just miles of interstate passing beneath his wheels while the western sky darkened with the approaching storm system. Maeve's voice came through the encrypted channel as Alden crossed into Wisconsin. "We have eyes on you from multiple positions. 2 unmarked vehicles are maintaining loose follow, and we have a helicopter on standby if visibility permits aerial surveillance. Remember, your job is just to drive normally. Don't acknowledge any unusual signage or detour instructions until we give you the go-ahead. If they make contact via CB radio, engage naturally, but don't mention anything that might spook them." Alden acknowledged the instructions and settled into the focused mindset he'd developed over 20 years of night driving, letting muscle memory handle the mechanics while his conscious mind stayed alert for anything out of pattern. The first snowflakes hit his windshield around 9:30, fat and lazy, melting instantly on the heated glass. Within 20 minutes, the storm had intensified to the point where visibility dropped below a quarter mile, and Alden reduced his speed to 45 miles per hour, matching the pace of other commercial traffic. The CB radio carried normal chatter, drivers reporting conditions and warning about accidents. Nothing that suggested criminal monitoring, but Alden knew they were listening, filtering through the routine transmissions to identify potential targets based on cargo value and route vulnerability. Mile marker 207 appeared through the blowing snow like a phantom, and Alden felt his pulse accelerate despite knowing he had backup this time. The way station exit was barely visible, orange barrels funneling traffic toward the facility's entrance, and the overhead sign showed green just as it had 3 weeks ago. "I'm approaching the station," Alden reported on the encrypted channel. "Sign indicates it's open." Maeve's response was immediate. "Copy that. We're tracking your position. Proceed as if you're complying with the normal way station requirements. We need to see if they've posted the fake closure sign." Alden followed the ramp down into the familiar bowl-shaped facility, and his headlights immediately caught the hand-lettered notice on the scale house door. The exact same message, the same paper and formatting, directing commercial vehicles to County Road MM for alternate routing. "Detour sign is posted," he reported. Same wording as before. Maeve's voice carried suppressed excitement. "Perfect. That's our evidence of ongoing criminal activity. Now, here's where it gets interesting. We want you to follow their detour instructions, but we'll have vehicles ahead and behind you the entire route. They won't be able to intercept without engaging law enforcement." The county road detour felt even more menacing this time, knowing what it represented. Alden followed the signs away from I-94, descending into darkness that seemed to swallow his headlights, and watched his mirrors for the unmarked police vehicles that Maeve promised were maintaining surveillance. But the mirrors showed only his own marker lights reflecting off falling snow. No other traffic visible despite assurances of constant backup. The CB radio crackled with the familiar mechanical voice, the one that had warned him before. "Turn around immediately. You're on the wrong route." But this time Alden recognized it for what it was, a recording designed to create confusion and fear. "I'm hearing the recorded warning," he reported. "Visibility is deteriorating rapidly. Can you confirm backup units are still with me?" Static answered his transmission on the encrypted channel, then Maeve's voice returned, distorted and breaking up. "Losing signal, atmospheric. Proceed to rendezvous." The communication failed completely, leaving Alden alone with just the CB radio and his own thoughts. This was wrong. Law enforcement had satellite communication systems that worked in any weather, and the encryption was supposed to be immune to atmospheric interference. Either the storm was more severe than predicted, or something was actively jamming his communication systems. The way station appeared ahead exactly as before, emerging from the blizzard as if it had been waiting for his return. Alden's chest constricted with the realization that he'd been led into the same trap, despite all the planning and backup. The criminals had either detected the surveillance operation and eliminated it, or they possessed capabilities that law enforcement had underestimated. He grabbed his CB mic and broadcast on the emergency channel. "Any units monitoring, this is a commercial driver in distress on County Road MM. requesting immediate law enforcement response. Only static answered. The scale house door opened, and the mechanical figure emerged exactly as it had 3 weeks ago, moving with inhuman precision toward his truck. But this time, Alden noticed details he'd missed during the initial encounter. The figure's coveralls bore a logo partially obscured by snow, and through his driver's window he could make out what appeared to be private security company insignia rather than DOT markings. This wasn't a supernatural manifestation or even a drugged victim. It was someone in a carefully constructed disguise, using deliberate movements to trigger primal fear responses in isolated drivers. Alden made a decision. Instead of fleeing as he'd done before, he set the parking brake and climbed down from the cab, positioning himself between the trailer and the scale house where he had maximum visibility and room to maneuver. The figure stopped 20 feet away, and Alden called out, voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. "I know what you are. I know this is a robbery operation. Law enforcement is watching right now, and everything you do is being recorded." It was a bluff since his communication systems were dead and he had no confirmation that backup existed, but he needed to disrupt their script and see how they responded when their target didn't react with expected panic. The figure tilted its head, and for a moment, Alden thought he'd gotten through to the human underneath the costume. Then it spoke, and the voice was different from the recording, natural and male, and carrying genuine surprise. "You came back. They said you'd run if we set the same trap, but you came back." Another figure emerged from the scale house, this one moving normally, and Alden recognized body language that suggested tactical training. Former military or law enforcement, someone who knew how to control space and read threat assessment in real time. "Where's your backup?" the second figure asked, scanning the empty road with practiced efficiency. "We've been monitoring police bands and we haven't detected any surveillance. So either you're incredibly stupid or incredibly brave coming back here alone." Alden's mind raced through options. If backup existed, they would have moved by now. If communication jamming was preventing coordination, he was genuinely alone. But he had one advantage these criminals didn't know about. The trailer behind him held GPS trackers that broadcast continuously, and even if voice communication failed, his position was being recorded by multiple redundant systems. "You want the load?" Alden said, keeping his voice level. "Take it. I'm not dying for $3 million of someone else's electronics." The admission of cargo value was calculated risk, confirming what they probably already knew from monitoring shipping databases. The second figure laughed. "Smart driver. Too bad we can't let you walk away. You talked to DOT investigators, you gave them evidence, you became a problem that needs solving." The casual acknowledgement of intent to harm made Alden's blood run cold. These weren't just thieves. They were willing to commit murder to protect their operation. That's when headlights blazed from multiple directions, flooding the way station with harsh illumination that turned falling snow into a wall of white. Vehicles that had been dark and invisible suddenly came alive, unmarked SUVs with concealed emergency lighting now flashing red and blue. Loudspeakers crackled with amplified commands. "This is Wisconsin State Police. Put your hands on your heads and kneel on the ground. Do it now." The two figures near Alden froze. Then the second one bolted toward the scale house, while the mechanical figure simply collapsed to the ground as if strings had been cut. More figures emerged from the building. 3 people Alden hadn't known were present, all moving with the frantic energy of criminals who'd just realized their operation had been compromised. The next 10 minutes were chaos orchestrated by law enforcement, with tactical teams surrounding the facility and systematically securing every person on site. Alden was directed to remain near his truck while officers cleared the building and processed the scene. He counted 7 arrests total, including individuals he'd never seen, all part of an operation that had been larger and more sophisticated than anyone had suspected. Maeve appeared from one of the unmarked vehicles, wearing tactical gear and looking simultaneously relieved and exhausted. "Your communication system was jammed by equipment in the scale house," she explained. "We maintained visual surveillance the entire time, but you couldn't hear our transmissions. When you confronted them instead of running, we had to move immediately to prevent them from harming you." The arrests led to discoveries that made Alden's encounter seem like just one thread in a much larger criminal tapestry. The scalehouse basement contained sophisticated monitoring equipment tracking DOT databases, shipping manifests, and weather patterns across 5 states. The future-dated scale tickets he'd found were indeed planning documents, part of a selection process that identified high-value loads and predicted optimal nights for interdiction based on storm forecasts and driver vulnerability assessments. Most disturbing were the records indicating successful thefts over a 4-year period, representing millions in stolen cargo and at least 9 missing drivers whose families had never received closure. The investigation expanded to include federal agencies when evidence revealed the operation had been fencing stolen goods through international networks. Several arrested individuals agreed to cooperation deals, providing testimony about the organization's structure and methods. Alden spent 3 days giving depositions and walking investigators through every detail of both his initial encounter and the sting operation. The prosecutor handling the case called him a hero, but Alden didn't feel heroic. He felt like someone who'd survived something that should have been impossible, then gotten lucky enough to help dismantle it before more people died. 2 months later, Alden was back on his regular routes, driving his own Cascadia and hauling loads that felt mundane after everything that had happened. The Mostyn Way station remained closed, yellow crime scene tape wrapped around the facility while forensic teams continued processing evidence. Wisconsin DOT had issued public advisories warning drivers about the criminal operation and encouraging anyone who'd experienced similar encounters to contact investigators. The response had been overwhelming, with dozens of drivers coming forward to report incidents they'd previously been too embarrassed or frightened to mention. But closure remained elusive. 3 of the arrested individuals had been released on bail and subsequently vanished, failing to appear for court dates and triggering federal fugitive warrants. Maeve warned Alden that these weren't people who forgot grudges, that his testimony had made him a permanent target for criminals sophisticated enough to have run this operation for years. He varied his routes obsessively now, avoided traveling during severe weather whenever possible, and maintained constant communication with other drivers through CB networks that served as informal early warning systems. On a humid night in July, Alden was driving through Nebraska when his CB radio crackled with a transmission that made his hands tighten on the wheel. The mechanical voice, the one he'd heard at the Mostyn Way station, speaking the same recorded message. "Turn around immediately. You're on the wrong route." He scanned his mirrors frantically but saw only normal traffic, nothing that suggested active pursuit. The transmission repeated twice more, then faded into static. Maybe it was atmospheric interference playing tricks with radio signals. Maybe it was a different operation using similar tactics in a different state. Or maybe it was a message, a reminder that the people he'd helped expose were still out there, waiting for opportunities that would eventually present themselves. Alden never learned which explanation was correct. He continued driving, continued delivering loads across the American highway system, continued participating in the prosecution of the criminals who'd been caught. But he also continued checking his mirrors, continued listening to CB radio with hyper-alert attention, continued remembering that night in the Wisconsin blizzard when he'd stumbled into something that turned routine commerce into a nightmare of manipulation and predation. The road had always been dangerous in obvious ways, weather and fatigue and mechanical failures. Now he understood it was dangerous in subtler ways too, through systems designed to exploit the isolation and vulnerability that define the trucking profession. The case would take years to fully resolve, with trials and appeals and complications from missing defendants. Some of the 9 families received closure when investigators located remains at sites the cooperating criminals identified. Others remained in limbo, hoping for answers that might never come. The stolen cargo was never fully recovered, most of it having been sold through networks that specialized in making things disappear into global markets where provenance didn't matter. Insurance companies paid out millions, shipping companies revised security protocols, and law enforcement agencies developed better coordination for investigating crimes that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. But for Alden, the real impact was simpler and more personal. He'd learned that the highway wasn't just a ribbon of asphalt connecting points on a map. It was an ecosystem where predators evolved strategies to exploit prey, where ordinary commerce created opportunities for extraordinary crime, and where isolation made everyone vulnerable to threats they couldn't anticipate. 20 years of experience had taught him to handle mechanical challenges and weather hazards. That night at the Mostyn Way station taught him that human threats were more adaptable and more patient than any natural danger. He still drives I-94 through Wisconsin, though never during winter storms, and he still passes the closed way station with its crime scene tape fading in the sun. Every time he sees it, he remembers the mechanical figure and the future-dated scale tickets, and the moment he realized the trap had been designed specifically to break drivers psychologically before robbing them physically. He remembers being genuinely uncertain whether he was experiencing supernatural phenomenon or human evil, and how that uncertainty had been the most effective weapon in the criminal's arsenal. Fear of the unknown was more paralyzing than fear of the known, and they'd weaponized it with precision. The highway doesn't care about stories or survival or justice. It just keeps extending forward into darkness, carrying trucks that hold everything American commerce requires. And somewhere in that darkness, people still wait for opportunities created by weather and isolation, and the trust that drivers place in signs and systems they assume operate according to legitimate rules. Alden knows this now in a way he didn't before. Knows it with the certainty of someone who's seen behind the curtain and can never quite forget what lurked there. He drives carefully, watches constantly, and shares his experience with other truckers who need to understand that threats on the road aren't always the ones you can see coming through your windshield. Some nights, when the CB radio crackles with static that sounds almost like words, he wonders if the fugitives are still operating somewhere, using different locations and refined tactics to continue preying on drivers. Other nights, he convinces himself that their arrest destroyed the operation completely, and any similar reports are just coincidence or copycat crimes. But deep down, in the place where 20 years of road wisdom accumulates, he suspects the truth is somewhere between those extremes. The way station might be closed, but the psychology it exploited remains constant. Drivers will always be vulnerable during storms, always isolated enough to become targets, always dependent on systems they trust to guide them safely through the dark. Thorne Galloway had been hauling livestock feed across the Midwest for 11 years, and he'd learned to respect winter with the kind of cautious reverence normally reserved for wild animals and unstable explosives. Tonight's run should have been straightforward. A simple delivery of cattle feed from a mill in Sioux City to a ranch operation outside of Fort Dodge, Iowa, following US 20 through flat prairie country where blizzards could materialize out of clear skies with terrifying speed. The weather forecast had called for light snow starting around midnight, accumulation of maybe 2 inches, nothing an experienced driver couldn't handle. But forecasts were predictions, not guarantees, and the storm that hit at 10:30 p.m. came down with the violence of something that had been building pressure for days rather than hours. Thorne's 2018 Peterbilt 389, pushed through snow that transformed highway into guesswork, visibility dropping from a quarter mile to 50 feet in the span of 15 minutes. His headlights carved tunnels through white chaos, revealing nothing but more snow and the occasional reflective marker post that confirmed he was still on pavement, rather than drifted into the agricultural fields stretching endlessly on both sides. The reefer unit wasn't necessary for this load, just a standard dry van filled with 50-pound bags of feed supplements stacked on pallets and secured with cargo straps. 22 tons of grain and minerals that ranchers needed to keep their cattle healthy through winter, and Thorne had promised delivery by morning because livestock didn't care about weather delays. The CB radio crackled with increasingly desperate chatter from other drivers caught in the same system. Eastbound US 20, visibility 0 at mile marker 153. I'm pulling over till this clears. Westbound on 20, lost the center line completely. Driving by feel and prayer. Any station monitoring what's the condition ahead toward Fort Dodge. Thorne added his own report. Westbound Peterbilt hauling feed, currently at marker 168. Storm intensified fast, recommend extreme caution or find shelter. A voice he recognized as belonging to a veteran grain hauler responded. Copy that, Peterbilt. I'm tucked into a truck stop at Sac City. This one's going to get worse before it gets better. Around mile marker 172, Thorne felt the Peterbilt's rear tandem slide left, despite having his speed down to 30 miles per hour. Black ice under the fresh accumulation, invisible and deadly. The kind of road condition that could jackknife a loaded rig before the driver realized what was happening. He corrected gently, letting off the throttle and allowing engine weight to pull the tractor back into alignment, but the experience triggered warning bells in his mind. Continuing in these conditions wasn't cautious. It was suicidal. He needed to find shelter and wait out the worst of the storm, even if that meant missing his delivery window and dealing with an angry customer. The problem was finding shelter. US 20 through this section of Iowa offered limited options, mostly small towns with minimal truck parking and services that closed by 9 p.m. The nearest truck stop was 40 miles ahead, which might as well have been on Mars given current visibility and road conditions. But there had to be something closer. Maybe a closed rest area, or a farm with an access road wide enough to accommodate his rig. Thorne scanned both sides of the highway, looking for any indication of civilization or refuge, and nearly missed the small brown sign that appeared briefly in his headlights. Callahan Livestock Auction, 2 miles, exit 174. Livestock auctions typically featured large paved lots designed to accommodate cattle trailers and commercial vehicles, and their buildings were substantial structures built to withstand Iowa weather. Even if the facility was closed for winter, the parking area would provide a place to ride out the storm with less risk than remaining on the highway. Thorne signaled right even though he couldn't see any other traffic, following trucking protocol that assumed someone might be close enough to observe his intentions. Exit 174 materialized as a simple 2-lane ramp that curved away from the highway and immediately felt wrong. Too narrow, too overgrown with vegetation, too much like a road that hadn't seen maintenance in years rather than months. But Thorne was committed now. His Peterbilt already descending the ramp with momentum that made reversing back onto US 20 effectively impossible. The pavement deteriorated quickly, giving way to gravel that crunched under his drive tires, then to dirt that had been frozen hard enough to support his weight, but felt treacherous beneath the snow. His GPS unit flickered and died, screen going black before displaying a no satellite signal error that shouldn't occur with modern equipment. He was navigating purely by the road itself now, following ruts that suggested other vehicles had used this route, though when or how recently remained impossible to determine. The livestock auction barn emerged from the blizzard like a monument to agricultural commerce, A massive structure, maybe 200 feet long and 60 feet wide, built from corrugated metal siding that had weathered to the color of dried blood. Sodium vapor lights mounted on tall poles cast yellow illumination across a parking area that could have held 50 vehicles but currently sat empty, snow accumulating in drifts against the building's windward side. But what caught Thorne's attention immediately was the generator. An industrial diesel unit sitting beneath a metal awning, exhaust pipe releasing visible fumes that indicated recent operation. Someone had been here, and not long ago, because generators didn't run themselves indefinitely without human intervention. Thorne guided his Peterbilt into the parking area and positioned the rig so his cab faced the building's main entrance, maintaining the trucker's instinct to always know where the exits were. He set the parking brake with a hiss of air pressure and left the engine idling while he considered his options. The smart move was probably to stay in the cab with heat and communication equipment, riding out the storm surrounded by familiar controls and relative comfort. But the generator's presence suggested someone might be inside the building, possibly auction staff or other travelers who'd sought shelter. At minimum, he should check for a working phone or Wi-Fi connection that might allow him to update dispatch about his delay. He grabbed his heavy flashlight and emergency radio, then climbed down into wind that hit like a physical assault. The cold was brutal, well below zero with wind chill, and snow penetrated every gap in his insulated coveralls despite the supposedly weatherproof construction. The walk to the barn's main entrance took maybe 30 seconds, but felt like crossing an Arctic wasteland, each step requiring conscious effort to maintain balance on ground made treacherous by ice and drifts. The entrance was a human-sized door set into the larger framework of loading gates designed for livestock trailers, and it opened with surprising ease when Thorne tested the handle. The interior was dark except for emergency lighting that cast dim red glow across a space designed to hold hundreds of cattle and the buyers who came to bid on them. Concrete floors sloped gently toward the central drains, and metal pens divided the space into sections that could be configured for different animals or crowd sizes. The air carried the smell of hay and animals, even though the facility appeared empty, decades of agricultural commerce having soaked into the building's bones until it couldn't be scrubbed away by mere abandonment. But the temperature inside was warmer than outside, maybe 45 degrees, suggesting the generator was powering heating elements or at least preventing the building from matching exterior conditions. "Hello?" Thorne called, his voice echoing strangely in the cavernous space. "Anybody here? I'm a commercial driver seeking shelter from the storm." No one answered, but he heard something else, a faint metallic ringing, like wind chimes or bells, coming from deeper in the building. The sound was rhythmic and almost musical, rising and falling with a pattern that suggested natural causes rather than mechanical ones. Probably loose metal fixtures responding to wind pressure, Thorne rationalized, though he couldn't identify where the wind would be coming from inside an enclosed structure. He moved deeper into the barn, flashlight beam sweeping across empty pens and auction platforms where cattle would have stood while buyers evaluated their quality. The facility had been substantial in its prime, built with the kind of agricultural investment that spoke to Iowa's ranching heritage. But abandonment showed in the details. Rust on metal surfaces, dust accumulated in corners, cobwebs stretched across doorways. Yet the generator continued running, and the emergency lights continued functioning, which meant someone was maintaining the building even if they weren't actively using it for auctions. In what appeared to be an office area toward the back of the building, Thorne found evidence of recent occupation. A desk with paperwork scattered across its surface, coffee mug still containing liquid that hadn't completely frozen, space heater plugged into a wall outlet and emanating faint warmth. He examined the paperwork with his flashlight, finding livestock auction records dated from the previous autumn, showing sales of cattle and pigs with buyer names and prices paid. Nothing particularly unusual, except that the dates put the last auction activity about 4 months ago, which raised questions about why the generator was running now during a winter storm. The metallic ringing grew louder as Thorne explored deeper, and he followed the sound through a maze of pens toward what he assumed was the livestock holding area, where animals would wait before being brought to auction. The space opened into a larger section of the barn, this one featuring multiple levels of metal gates and pens arranged in complex patterns that maximize capacity while allowing handlers to move animals efficiently. And here Thorne discovered the source of the ringing. Metal gates were hanging loose on their hinges, swinging slightly in air currents he couldn't feel, and the contact between gate and frame produced the bell-like sound he'd been hearing. But something about the pattern bothered him. The gates were swinging in unison, all moving at the same frequency and amplitude despite being separated by considerable distances. Natural wind patterns shouldn't produce such coordinated movement, and the air inside the barn felt still despite the blizzard raging outside. Thorne approached one of the gates and stopped it with his hand, watching to see if it would resume swinging on its own. For several seconds it remained motionless, then slowly began moving again, building momentum until it matched the rhythm of the other gates around it. Like something was deliberately creating resonance, using the building's structure as an instrument. A sound behind him made Thorne spin, flashlight beam cutting through darkness to reveal nothing but empty space. Yet he definitely heard something, the scrape of boot on concrete or the rustle of clothing against metal. "I know someone's here," he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm not looking for trouble, just waiting out the storm. If you're the facility owner, I apologize for trespassing and I'll be happy to pay for using your generator power." Still no response, but the silence felt different now, occupied rather than empty, as if something was listening and choosing not to reveal itself. Thorne's trucking instincts screamed at him to return to his Peterbilt and lock himself in until morning, but he'd come too far into the building to retreat without understanding what was happening. The generator outside was running for a reason. The gates were swinging through mechanisms he couldn't explain, and someone or something was present in this abandoned facility despite the blizzard conditions that should have kept everyone away. He needed answers before he committed to spending the night here, because the wrong kind of answers might make the highway storm seem preferable to whatever shelter this barn offered. He found the generator control room in a shed attached to the main building, accessible through a metal door that had been left slightly ajar. Inside, the diesel unit rumbled with mechanical reliability, fuel gauge showing 3/4 full, temperature and pressure readings all within normal parameters. Someone had definitely serviced this equipment recently, probably within the past few days, because diesel generators didn't maintain themselves through Iowa winters. Next to the generator sat a propane heating system with lines running throughout the building, explaining the relative warmth inside. Both systems had been activated deliberately, which meant someone had prepared this facility to accommodate people during the storm. A logbook sat on a shelf above the generator controls, and Thorne flipped through pages with growing unease. The entries were written in multiple hands, different people documenting generator starts and fuel consumption over the past several months. But the pattern was wrong. The generator had been started primarily during severe weather events, blizzards and ice storms when travel would be dangerous and shelter would be valuable. And each entry included notes about guests taking refuge, numbers ranging from 1 to 7 individuals, though no names were provided. The most recent entry was dated tonight, written in neat cursive. Generator started 2100 hours. Expected guests 3 to 5. Facility prepared. Thorne's breath caught. Someone had known the storm was coming, and had prepared this facility to trap travelers who sought shelter here. But for what purpose? Robbery seemed most likely. Isolated drivers carrying valuable cargo or personal possessions, desperate enough to abandon caution in exchange for protection from the elements. But the preparation suggested something more elaborate than simple theft. An organized operation that required advanced planning and multiple participants. He needed to get back to his truck immediately and radio for help, assuming he could get enough cell signal or CB range to reach someone who could respond. He was turning to leave when he heard voices. Not from inside the building, but from outside, approaching through the storm. Multiple people talking in low tones, their words muffled by wind, but carrying the unmistakable cadence of human conversation. Thorne killed his flashlight and pressed against the generator room wall, watching through a gap in the door as shadows moved across the snow-covered parking area. 3 figures, maybe 4, bundled in winter gear and carrying what looked like tools or equipment. They moved toward the barn's main entrance with the confidence of people who knew exactly where they were going. The voices grew clearer as they entered the building. Male voices primarily, with at least one female, discussing something about timing and the schedule and making sure everything's ready before they arrive. Thorne's mind raced through scenarios. These people clearly operated this facility as some kind of trap for stranded travelers. But what happened to the travelers after they took shelter? Were they robbed and released, or was this something darker? The logbook mentioned guests without explaining what became of them, and the care taken to maintain the generator and heating suggested an operation that had been running for months or possibly years. He couldn't get back to his truck without crossing open ground that the newcomers would see, and hiding in the generator room only delayed the inevitable confrontation. His only option was to move deeper into the barn and find another exit, hoping the building had multiple access points designed for livestock movement. Thorne slipped out of the generator room and worked his way through the maze of pens, using the metallic ringing of swinging gates to mask the sound of his own movement. Behind him, the voices grew louder as the newcomers spread through the facility, clearly searching for something or preparing the space for whatever came next. In a corner of the livestock holding area, Thorne found stairs leading down to a lower level he hadn't known existed. The steps were concrete, worn smooth by decades of boots, and they descended into darkness that his flashlight barely penetrated. He took the stairs carefully, knowing that a fall down here would leave him injured and helpless, and emerged into a basement space that ran the length of the building. This area would have been used for storage and equipment maintenance, with concrete walls holding back earth and wooden support beams rising to the ceiling above. But the air down here smelled wrong, carrying a chemical taint that reminded Thorne of exhaust fumes. That's when he realized the danger he was in wasn't just from the people above. The propane heating system and diesel generator both produced carbon monoxide, and if the ventilation system wasn't working properly, deadly gas could be accumulating in this enclosed basement space. Already he felt lightheaded, though whether from actual CO exposure or just panic and exertion he couldn't determine. He needed to find an exit, get back to his truck, and get far away from this facility before whatever operation these people ran claimed him as their next victim. The basement held another discovery that made his blood run cold. Storage lockers lined one wall, the kind with combination locks that promise security for valuable contents. Most were closed and secured, but one hung open, its door swinging slightly in air currents. Inside, Thorne saw personal effects. Wallets, phones, identification cards, all sorted and stacked with the efficiency of someone cataloging inventory. He recognized some of the IDs as commercial driver's licenses. People who drove trucks for a living just like him, at least a dozen different individuals represented. Their belongings stored down here like trophies, or evidence that needed to be hidden from casual discovery. Thorne's hands shook as he examined the driver's licenses, recognizing the format and state seals that marked them as legitimate documentation: Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, Iowa itself. Drivers from across the Midwest who'd disappeared under circumstances that probably mirrored his own situation. Seeking shelter from winter storms, finding this facility, and then never making it back to their trucks. The implication was clear and horrifying. This wasn't just robbery. People were dying here, their belongings cataloged and stored like inventory from successful hunting expeditions. The number of licenses suggested this operation had been running for at least 2 winters, maybe longer, with victims accumulating at a rate of maybe 1 or 2 per month during severe weather. He needed to move. The voices above had spread throughout the building, footsteps echoing on concrete as the newcomers conducted what sounded like a systematic search. They were looking for him, or for whoever the generator logs predicted would arrive seeking shelter. Thorne pocketed 3 of the driver's licenses, evidence that would prove what was happening here if he managed to escape and contact authorities. Then he moved deeper into the basement, following support beams toward what he hoped would be an exterior access point. Most agricultural buildings included basement exits for equipment and supply delivery, and this facility was large enough to potentially have multiple egress routes. The air quality worsened as he progressed, the chemical smell of carbon monoxide growing stronger until his head throbbed with the beginning stages of poisoning. He pulled his jacket collar up over his nose and mouth, trying to filter the air through fabric that probably offered minimal protection but was better than breathing directly. His flashlight beam revealed heating ducts running along the ceiling, and he noticed that several vents had been deliberately blocked with rags or wooden boards. Someone had sabotaged the ventilation system, ensuring that CO would accumulate in the basement rather than being properly exhausted outside. This wasn't negligence. It was murder by design. A metal door appeared at the far end of the basement, industrial grade with a push-bar mechanism that should allow exit without keys. Thorne hit the bar with his shoulder and felt the door resist, then give slightly before stopping against something blocking it from outside. Snow drift, he realized, winter accumulation that had piled against the exterior enough to prevent the door from opening fully. He threw his weight against it repeatedly, opening a gap of maybe 6 inches that let in a blast of freezing air and swirling snow. The gap was too narrow for his body, but it provided fresh oxygen and a potential escape route if he could clear enough snow. Behind him, footsteps descended the basement stairs, multiple people moving with the coordinated efficiency of a practiced team. Flashlight beams swept across the space, and Thorne heard a male voice call out with false friendliness. "Driver, we know you're down here. Generator logs showed your truck arrived, and we're just trying to help you get through the storm safely. No need to hide." The statement was absurd, given what Thorne had discovered, but it confirmed that these people monitored arrivals and had anticipated his presence. The generator logs that mentioned expected guests weren't predictions. They were hunting schedules. Thorne wedged himself into a gap between support beams and killed his flashlight, gambling that darkness would provide better concealment than movement. The CO exposure was making him dizzy, thoughts fragmenting in ways that suggested his judgment was already compromised. He needed fresh air desperately, but opening that door wider would create noise that would pinpoint his location. Through the 6-inch gap, wind howled with the fury of the blizzard, and he could see nothing but white chaos that promised death by exposure, almost as certainly as staying here promised death by poisoning or violence. The searchers spread through the basement systematically, checking behind equipment and storage areas with thoroughness that spoke to experience finding hidden people. Their flashlight beams created moving shadows that made the space feel surreal, and Thorne fought the urge to simply step out and confront them. 11 years of trucking had taught him that direct confrontation rarely favored the person who was outnumbered and trapped in unfamiliar territory. Better to wait, watch for opportunities, and exploit any mistakes his pursuers made. "Check the storage lockers," a female voice commanded. "If he found those, he knows what we're doing here. We can't let him leave." The admission was stated so matter-of-factly that it took Thorne a moment to process the full implications. These people understood they were operating a murder-for-profit scheme, accepted the necessity of eliminating witnesses, and coordinated their activities with the casual efficiency of any business operation. How many times had they done this? How many drivers had descended into this basement seeking shelter only to discover they'd walked into an elaborate death trap? Footsteps approached Thorne's hiding spot, and he pressed deeper into the shadows between support beams, barely breathing as a flashlight beam swept past his position. The searcher was male, middle-aged from the sound of his breathing, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who'd done this before. "Nothing here," the man called back to his companions. "Just old equipment and empty space. Maybe he's still upstairs." The beam moved away, and Thorne released breath he'd been holding, but knew his concealment was temporary. Eventually, they'd conduct a second, more thorough search, or they'd simply wait by his truck until CO poisoning forced him to either emerge or lose consciousness. The female voice spoke again, this time addressing someone Thorne couldn't see. "Burrow, check the exterior door. If he's trying to force it open, we'll need to intercept before he gets outside." Heavy footsteps moved toward Thorne's position, and he recognized he had maybe 30 seconds before discovery. The gap in the door represented his only chance, inadequate as it was. He moved quickly, sacrificing stealth for speed, and threw himself against the door with all his weight. The snow outside gave slightly, widening the gap to maybe 10 inches, enough to get his head and one shoulder through, but not his torso. "There!" The shout came from behind him as flashlight beams converged on his position. Thorne pushed harder, feeling metal doorframe scrape against his ribs through the insulated coveralls. His head and shoulders were outside now, exposed to wind that felt like being sandblasted with ice, and he used his arms to claw at snow, trying to clear enough space to pull his body through. Hands grabbed his legs from inside, multiple people working together to drag him back into the basement. He kicked viciously, connecting with something that produced a grunt of pain, and the grip loosened enough for him to make another 6 inches of progress. Then he was through, tumbling into snow that reached his chest, the door slamming shut behind him as his pursuers lost their grip. The blizzard swallowed him immediately, visibility dropping to zero as wind-driven snow filled every gap in his vision. Thorne had no idea which direction led back to his truck or to safety. The barn was a dark mass to his left, barely visible through the storm, but everything else was featureless white chaos. He picked a direction that felt like it might angle toward the parking area and started moving, each step requiring enormous effort as he plowed through drifts that shifted and reformed with every gust. Behind him, voices shouted commands that the wind scattered into meaninglessness. They'd be coming through the door or around the building to intercept him, and they knew this property's layout while he was navigating blind. His only advantage was the storm itself, weather so severe that even his pursuers would struggle to maintain visual contact. He focused on moving steadily rather than quickly, knowing that exhaustion and cold would kill him as efficiently as any human threat if he panicked and burned through his energy reserves. Something solid loomed ahead, and Thorne recognized the angular shape of his Peterbilt's trailer, the familiar outline of the dry van he'd been hauling since Sioux City. Relief flooded through him with enough intensity to make his knees weak. He worked his way along the trailer's length toward the cab, using the vehicle as a guide through the disorienting storm. The driver's door was still unlocked, exactly as he'd left it, and he hauled himself into the seat with muscles that screamed protest. Inside, the cab was cold but offered shelter from the wind, and Thorne immediately fired the engine, needing heat and light and the psychological comfort of familiar surroundings. The dashboard illuminated with its usual display of gauges and warning lights, everything reading normal, and Thorne felt some of the panic recede. He was back in his element, surrounded by controls he understood and systems he could trust. The CB radio crackled with static, and he grabbed the mic with hands that still trembled from adrenaline and CO exposure. "Mayday, Mayday, any station monitoring. Commercial driver at Callahan Livestock Auction off US 20 exit 174. Multiple hostiles on site, evidence of previous murders. Requesting immediate law enforcement response." Static answered, the storm apparently blocking transmission range, and Thorne tried Channel 9, the emergency frequency. Same result, just white noise and the occasional fragment of voices too distant and distorted to understand. His cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't surprising given the rural location and weather conditions. He was still effectively isolated, trapped at a facility where people clearly intended to harm him, with no way to summon help until the storm cleared enough to restore communication. The smart move would be to drive away immediately, abandon the livestock feed and get back to US 20, where other traffic might provide safety through witnesses. He put the Peterbilt in gear and eased forward, following his own tracks through the snow back toward what he hoped was the exit road. The headlights revealed nothing useful, just swirling white that made depth perception impossible and direction uncertain. After 50 yards, the truck's front end dropped suddenly as the ground fell away, wheels spinning as they lost traction on what felt like a drainage ditch or embankment. Thorne reversed, felt the tandem's grip, and backed away from the hidden hazard. He tried a different angle, but the same thing happened. Wheels finding empty air where solid ground should have been. The realization settled over him like a weight. They'd prepared this trap thoroughly, knowing that drivers who escaped the building would try to flee in their vehicles. The parking area had been designed or modified to funnel trucks into positions where leaving became difficult or impossible without daylight and clear visibility. Even if he could navigate out during the blizzard, they might have blocked the exit road or sabotaged it in ways he wouldn't discover until his truck was high-centered or stuck in a position where recovery required equipment he didn't have. Thorne killed the headlights and watched through his mirrors as flashlight beams appeared near the barn, multiple figures spreading out to search the parking area. They were being methodical, checking around the building first before expanding their search pattern. He had maybe 5 minutes before they reached his position, and then what? They couldn't physically drag him out of a locked truck, but they could damage his vehicle, disable it, and wait for exposure or CO poisoning to force him out. Or they could use weapons, shooting through the windows or setting fire to the cab, options that someone willing to commit serial murder wouldn't hesitate to employ. His eyes fell on the trailer behind him, 53 feet of enclosed space filled with feed bags. The dry van wasn't climate-controlled, but it was insulated and weatherproof, and the rear doors opened from inside using an emergency release mechanism required by federal safety regulations. If he could get into the trailer without being seen, he'd have a hiding place they might not think to check immediately. More importantly, the trailer's interior would be warmer than staying in the cab with the engine off, and he could potentially wait them out until dawn brought better visibility and hopefully passing traffic on US 20. Thorne grabbed his flashlight and emergency kit, then slipped out of the cab on the passenger side, using the truck's bulk to shield his movement from the searchers. The wind immediately tried to knock him down, and snow stung exposed skin on his face with enough force to draw blood. He worked his way along the trailer's length to the rear doors, found the external latch, and pulled. The doors swung open with a groan of cold metal, revealing darkness and the distinctive smell of processed grain. Thorne climbed inside, pulled the doors closed behind him, and engage the interior latch that would prevent them from being opened from outside without tools. The trailer's interior was pitch black and disorienting, his flashlight beam revealing stacks of feed bags rising to the ceiling. The space was narrow, maybe 8 feet wide, with cargo secured on pallets that left minimal room for movement. But it was dry and significantly warmer than outside, the insulation and residual heat from the bags themselves creating a microenvironment that felt almost comfortable after the brutal cold. Thorne worked his way between the pallets toward the front of the trailer, finding a gap where he could wedge himself and remain hidden if someone managed to force the doors open. Outside, he heard engines starting, multiple vehicles moving around the parking area. They were organizing a systematic search, using their own trucks to provide light and mobility. Thorne checked his phone again, hoping that being inside the metal trailer might somehow improve signal reception, but the screen still showed no bars. He was completely cut off, dependent entirely on his own resources and whatever mistakes his pursuers might make. 11 years of trucking had prepared him for mechanical failures, weather emergencies, and even basic medical crises. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for this, being hunted by organized criminals who'd turned an abandoned agricultural facility into a murder site. His mind raced through options, each one problematic. He could wait in the trailer until dawn, gambling that daylight would let him escape, or that passing traffic on US 20 would notice his situation. But if these people maintained watch through the night, he'd emerge to face the same hostile situation with the added disadvantage of exhaustion. He could try to barricade himself and hope the storm cleared enough for CB or cell communication to work. But that was passive, surrendering initiative to people who clearly had more experience with this scenario than he did. The third option was riskier, but potentially more effective. He could use the trailer as shelter while planning an active countermeasure, something that would disrupt their operation and create opportunities for escape. The feed bags around him were flammable under the right conditions, and his emergency kit included road flares that burned hot enough to ignite almost anything. If he could create a distraction, maybe a fire that forced them to respond, he might be able to slip away during the confusion. It was desperate and dangerous, but doing nothing guaranteed that when dawn came, he'd be facing people who'd already murdered at least a dozen drivers and had no reason to let him become the exception. A sound outside made Thorne freeze, footsteps crunching through snow, approaching the trailer's rear doors. Someone tested the latch, found it engaged, and spoke loudly enough to be heard through the metal walls. "Driver, I know you're in there. My name is Burl Fenner, and I own this property. We need to talk about your situation." The voice was older, male, carrying a false reasonableness that probably worked on people who didn't know what Thorne knew. "The storm's going to last all night, and you can't survive in that trailer without heat. Come out now, and we can discuss this like civilized people." Thorne said nothing, recognizing the statement as a negotiation tactic designed to establish dialogue. Once you started talking, you'd revealed your position and given them information to use against you. Better to remain silent and unpredictable, forcing them to make assumptions that might create exploitable errors. Burl tried again. "I understand you found some things in the basement that concerned you. I can explain everything, but I need you to come out and talk face to face. This doesn't have to end badly for anyone." The lie was so transparent that Thorne almost laughed. This absolutely was going to end badly for someone. The only question was who. He checked his watch, surprised to discover it was only 11:40. The entire experience from entering the barn to reaching this point had consumed less than an hour, though it felt like days. Dawn was still 7 hours away, an eternity when you were trapped in a metal box surrounded by people who'd proven themselves capable of serial murder. Burl's voice returned, sounding less friendly now. "Driver, "You're making this harder than it needs to be. We control this property. We control your vehicle, and we control whether you survive until morning. The smart move is to cooperate before someone gets hurt." The threat was clear, but Thorne noticed something interesting. They weren't trying to force the doors or damage the trailer. That suggested either they lacked tools for the job, or they were concerned about damaging cargo that might have value. The livestock feed wasn't particularly valuable, but they might not know that, and preserving his ignorance might be the leverage he needed. "I've got a full load of controlled pharmaceuticals," Thorne called out, improvising. "Worth about $2 million on the black market. You damage this trailer or threaten me, and you lose the whole shipment. But if we negotiate properly, maybe we can both walk away with something." The lie came easily, born from 11 years of talking his way through weigh stations and customer complaints. He had no idea if they'd believe him, but desperation made people receptive to possibilities they'd normally question. Silence followed his statement, then footsteps moving away from the trailer. They were consulting, deciding whether his claim was legitimate or an obvious fabrication. Thorne used the time to inventory his emergency kit properly. Road flares, first aid supplies, energy bars, water bottles, basic tools. Nothing that qualified as a weapon, but plenty that could be improvised for purposes the manufacturers never intended. The road flares were his best option, capable of burning at nearly 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit and producing enough smoke to create confusion and potentially trigger CO alarms if this facility had any functional safety systems. Burrell's voice returned, but this time he wasn't addressing Thorne. He was speaking to his companions, voice carrying through the trailer walls despite attempts at discretion. "If he's telling the truth about pharmaceuticals, this could be our biggest score ever. But we need to verify before we commit resources." A female voice responded, the same one Thorne had heard in the basement. "Check the manifest. Most pharmaceutical loads have paperwork visible through the cab windows. If he's lying, we proceed with standard protocol." Standard protocol. The phrase made Thorne's stomach clench, confirming that this operation had been refined through repetition. They had procedures for every scenario, responses they'd practiced until they became routine. He was just another problem to be solved using methods they'd already perfected on previous victims. The only variable was whether his pharmaceutical lie bought him time or accelerated their timeline for eliminating him as a threat. Thorne heard them moving around his truck, doors opening and closing as they searched the cab for documentation that would verify or disprove his pharmaceutical claim. He'd left his bills of lading in the driver's side door pocket. Paperwork that clearly identified his cargo as livestock feed worth maybe $8,000 total. Within 2 minutes, they'd know he'd lied, and whatever slim advantage that deception provided would evaporate. He needed to act before they returned to the trailer with renewed determination to eliminate him as a witness to their operation. The road flares came in a pack of 3, each one capable of burning for 30 minutes and producing enough heat to ignite the paper and cloth components of the feed bags. Thorne pulled one from his emergency kit and positioned himself near the trailer's rear doors, gambling that he could create chaos and escape in the confusion. But the more he considered the plan, the more problems emerged. Starting a fire inside an enclosed metal container while he was still inside was suicide by smoke inhalation. And even if he somehow escaped, setting fire to his own trailer would destroy his livelihood and potentially face him with criminal charges for arson and reckless endangerment. "He's lying!" The female voice carried clearly through the trailer walls. "Cargo manifest shows livestock feed. Shipper is a grain mill in Sioux City. There's no pharmaceuticals, just cattle supplements and hay pellets." Burrell's response was quieter but audible. "Then we proceed as planned. Standard protocol, clean sweep. Vehicle gets stripped for parts tomorrow after the storm clears." The casual way they discussed his murder made Thorne's hands shake with rage as much as fear. These weren't desperate criminals acting on impulse. They were business people discussing the disposal of an inconvenient asset. Footsteps approached the trailer again, and this time Thorne heard the distinctive sound of tools. They were going to force the doors, either using pry bars or cutting equipment. He had maybe 3 minutes before they breached his shelter and found him wedged between feed pallets with nowhere left to run. The flare plan was looking less suicidal and more like his only remaining option. He struck the ignition cap, and the flare burst to life with a brilliant red glow and a hiss of burning chemicals. The light was blinding in the trailer's darkness, and Thorne immediately regretted the decision as smoke began filling the enclosed space. But committed now, he touched the flare to the nearest feed bag, watching as the paper packaging caught and began to burn. The flames spread slowly at first, then with increasing intensity as the fire found the processed grain inside. Within seconds, multiple bags were burning, filling the trailer with heat and smoke that made breathing nearly impossible. Thorne covered his nose and mouth with his jacket sleeve and moved towards the rear doors, pounding on them from inside. "Fire! The trailer's on fire! You've got maybe a minute before the whole thing goes up." The pounding on the exterior doors stopped immediately, replaced by urgent voices. "Is he serious? Smoke's coming from the vents. Get water. We need to suppress this before it spreads to the tractor." Thorne heard them running, their footsteps fading as they presumably went to find firefighting equipment. He used the moment to engage the interior emergency release, a lever that federal regulations required on all enclosed trailers to prevent people from being trapped inside. The mechanism disengaged the exterior latch, and Thorne kicked the doors open, stumbling out into the blizzard with smoke pouring from the trailer behind him. The storm had intensified, if anything, snow falling so thick that visibility was down to maybe 10 feet. Thorne couldn't see his pursuers, though he heard them shouting commands somewhere in the white chaos. He picked a direction away from the voices and started moving, using the wind against his face as a crude compass bearing. The snow was hip-deep in places where drifts had formed, and each step required exhausting effort. But fear provided energy, the knowledge that stopping meant dying in ways that made hypothermia seem merciful by comparison. Behind him, the trailer fire created an orange glow visible even through the blizzard, and Thorne heard the whoosh of flames finding new fuel. The feed bags were burning in earnest now, and the dry van's insulation was catching, creating a conflagration that would be visible from US 20 if anyone was watching. That was the gamble, that the fire would attract attention from passing vehicles or emergency services monitoring the area. But in this storm, with visibility measured in feet rather than miles, the chances of anyone noticing seemed vanishingly small. Thorne's boot caught on something buried under the snow, and he fell forward, hands plunging into a drift that was colder than anything he'd experienced in 11 years of winter driving. When he pushed himself upright, his hands were numb, and his face felt like it had been scrubbed with sandpaper. The wind chill had to be 40 below, cold enough to cause frostbite in exposed skin within minutes. His coveralls provided some protection, but they were designed for working around trucks in cold weather, not for extended exposure to blizzard conditions. He needed to find shelter soon, or the storm would finish what Burl Fenner's operation had started. A dark shape loomed ahead, and Thorne recognized a vehicle, though not his own truck. This was a pickup, probably belonging to one of the people hunting him, and it had been left running with interior lights on. Through the fogged windows he could see the glow of a dashboard and what looked like radio equipment. Someone had been monitoring communications, possibly trying to intercept any calls Thorne might have made if his CB or cell phone had worked. The vehicle represented transportation and shelter, but it also represented a trap. Taking it would alert his pursuers immediately, and they'd have other vehicles to give chase. But Thorne was out of options. Continuing on foot in this storm guaranteed death by exposure within the hour. He yanked open the driver's door and climbed inside, immediately hit by warmth that felt like salvation. The keys were in the ignition, and the fuel gauge showed 3/4 full. The radio equipment mounted on the dashboard was sophisticated, police scanner quality, capable of monitoring multiple frequencies simultaneously. He scanned through the channels and heard what he'd feared. They were coordinating on a private frequency using handheld radios to organize the search. Subject escaped from trailer fire, last seen heading northwest toward the tree line. That was Burl's voice, calm and professional. "Leona, take the west perimeter. I'll cover north. He's on foot in a blizzard, so effective search radius is maybe a 1/4 mile. We find him in the next 30 minutes or nature does the work for us." Another voice responded, female, the one Thorne had heard earlier. "Copy that. What about the fire?" Burl's answer was pragmatic. "Let it burn. We'll report it as storm-related damage tomorrow. Right now, the priority is containment." Containment. They were talking about him like he was a chemical spill or hazardous waste that needed to be cleaned up before anyone noticed. Thorne put the pickup in gear and eased forward, testing the vehicle's response to snow conditions. The truck had 4-wheel drive and good tires, probably winterized specifically for operating in these conditions. It handled the drifts competently, and Thorne felt a surge of hope. If he could find the exit road and make it back to US 20, he'd have a chance of flagging down another truck or reaching a location with working communication. The problem was navigation. The storm had disoriented him completely, and the property's layout was unknown territory. He could be driving deeper into the facility or toward the exit road. No way to know without landmarks that were invisible through the blizzard. His only reference was the burning trailer, the orange glow that marked where he'd started. He kept that light behind him and drove in what felt like a straight line, hoping geometry would eventually lead him to a property boundary or road. The radio crackled with Burl's voice. "Who's got the west pickup? Someone respond." Silence followed, then, "Vehicle's gone. Subject took the west pickup in his mobile. All units converge on the exit road. We can't let him reach the highway." Thorne's advantage had been discovered faster than he'd hoped, but at least now he knew he was heading in the right direction. If they were moving to block the exit road, that meant he was moving toward it. Headlights appeared in his mirrors, 2 sets, both closing fast. They knew this property intimately and could drive aggressively while Thorne was forced to navigate cautiously through terrain he couldn't see. The chase would be measured in seconds, not minutes. He pressed the accelerator harder, feeling the truck's tires break traction and slip before the 4-wheel drive system compensated. The exit road had to be close, just beyond the next drift or around the next building. But close was relative in a blizzard where distance became meaningless and every landmark looked identical. A fence appeared in his headlights, wooden posts and barbed wire marking a property boundary. Thorne turned parallel to it, using the fence as a guide toward what had to be the entrance. Behind him, the pursuing vehicles were close enough now that their headlights cut through the falling snow with harsh intensity. One of them attempted to pull alongside, probably planning to force him off the road or box him against the fence. Thorne swerved right, felt the pickup's front bumper clip a fence post, and kept going. The post snapped with a crack audible over the wind, and barbed wire scraped along the truck's side with a metallic shriek. The exit road materialized suddenly, a gap in the fence line where gravel met snow-covered pavement. Thorne took the turn too fast, felt the rear end slide out, and corrected with steering input that 11 years of winter driving had made instinctive. The truck straightened, found traction, and accelerated up the ramp toward US 20. Behind him, one of the pursuing vehicles attempted the same turn and wasn't as fortunate. Thorne saw headlights pivot wildly in his mirror before disappearing entirely, probably sliding off the road into the ditch. The second vehicle slowed, and he gained precious seconds of separation. US 20 appeared like a promise of salvation, a ribbon of snow-covered asphalt that represented civilization and safety. Thorne turned west, following the highway's curve and immediately spotting taillights ahead. Another truck, a legitimate traveler, pushing through the storm at careful speed. Thorne accelerated to close the distance, laying on the horn in continuous blasts that announced emergency. The truck ahead slowed and pulled to the shoulder, hazard lights flashing. Thorne stopped behind it and climbed out, fighting the wind to reach the other driver's window. The trucker, a woman in her 50s, rolled down her window with obvious concern. "You all right, driver?" Thorne's explanation came in gasps, adrenaline and exertion making coherent speech difficult. "Livestock auction barn, mile marker 174. Criminal operation, multiple murders. Need to contact police immediately." The woman's expression shifted from concern to alarm, and she grabbed her CB mic. "Brake emergency. Brake emergency. Any law enforcement monitoring, we have a commercial driver reporting criminal activity at exit 174. Static answered, then a professional voice. "This is Iowa State Patrol. Identify your location and nature of emergency." The woman handed Thorne her mic, and he provided details with the precision of someone who knew his testimony would be scrutinized. Location, what he'd discovered in the basement, the pursuit through the blizzard, everything delivered in short, factual statements. The patrol officer's questions were thorough, and Thorne answered each one while watching his mirrors for signs of continued pursuit. But the vehicles from the auction barn had apparently decided that following him onto the highway represented too much exposure. "Units are responding to your location," the officer said. "Severe weather is complicating response time, but we have troopers within 10 miles. Stay on the highway and keep this channel open." The woman trucker offered Thorne shelter in her cab while they waited, and he accepted gratefully, his body beginning to register the punishment it had endured. Frostbite threatened his fingers and face, his lungs burned from smoke inhalation and CO exposure, and exhaustion made coherent thought increasingly difficult. The state patrol arrived 40 minutes later, 3 vehicles with lights cutting through the storm like beacons. The troopers took Thorne's statement while emergency medical technicians treated his injuries and evaluated him for serious damage. His story about the driver's licenses in the basement got immediate attention, and within an hour, a tactical team was assembling to raid the livestock auction facility. But the storm prevented immediate action, with officers unwilling to risk lives attempting entry during whiteout conditions. They'd have to wait for dawn and better visibility before moving against what Thorne had described. A paramedic named Leona Platt rode with Thorne to the hospital in Fort Dodge, monitoring his vital signs and providing oxygen to help clear his system of CO. She asked questions about his experience, professional inquiries mixed with obvious horror at what he'd endured. "How many people do you think are involved in this operation?" Thorne considered the question carefully. "I encountered at least 5 distinct individuals, but there could be more. They operated with coordination that suggested practice and planning. This wasn't opportunistic crime, it was systematic predation." Leona's expression darkened. "We've had missing trucker reports in this area for the past 2 years. State Patrol investigated but never found evidence of foul play. If what you're saying is true, we might finally understand what happened to those drivers." The number 2 years aligned with what Thorne had seen in the basement, at least a dozen victims over multiple winter seasons. He'd been lucky, or smart enough to recognize the danger before it consumed him completely. But luck was fickle, and if any single variable had been different, his driver's license would have joined the collection in those storage lockers. At the hospital, doctors treated Thorne for frostbite, smoke inhalation, and early-stage hypothermia. None of the injuries were life-threatening, but they would have become so if he'd remained exposed much longer. While he recovered in an observation room, State Patrol investigators came to take a detailed statement, recording every aspect of his experience. They were particularly interested in the basement storage lockers and the driver's licenses he'd seen. Thorne had grabbed 3 of them during his escape, evidence that now occupied marked bags in the patrol's evidence custody. "We'll cross-reference these licenses with missing persons reports," one investigator explained. "If they match drivers who disappeared in this area, that gives us probable cause for multiple homicide charges. Your testimony about the generator logs and the conversation you overheard about standard protocol establishes premeditation. We're building a strong case, but we need to arrest these people before they destroy evidence or flee." Thorne asked the question that had been haunting him since his escape. "How many trucks do you think they've robbed? How many drivers are buried somewhere on that property?" The investigator's answer was careful, probably constrained by what he could legally discuss with a witness. "Based on missing persons reports and the physical evidence you described, we're potentially looking at a dozen or more victims over a 2 to 3 year period. But until we can search the property thoroughly and recover remains, those are just estimates. A dozen drivers, a dozen families without closure, millions in stolen cargo, and an operation sophisticated enough to have evaded detection for years." The scale of it made Thorne feel nauseous, knowing how close he'd come to becoming another statistic. Dawn brought clearing skies and temperatures that remained brutally cold, but at least allowed visibility. The tactical team moved on the livestock auction facility at 7:30 a.m., finding it abandoned. Burl Fenner and his accomplices had fled during the night, taking whatever evidence they could transport and leaving behind a burning trailer that had collapsed into a smoking ruin. But the basement remained intact, and forensic teams recovered exactly what Thorne had described. Storage lockers filled with personal effects from missing drivers, a ventilation system deliberately sabotaged to accumulate CO, and most damning, generator logs documenting guests who arrived during storms and never left. The property search expanded to surrounding farmland, and within 3 days investigators had located a section of woods where ground-penetrating radar suggested multiple burial sites. The excavation would take weeks, but preliminary findings confirmed human remains consistent with the missing driver's descriptions. DNA testing would take longer, but the investigators were confident they'd identified the dumping ground where Burl Fenner's operation had disposed of victims for at least 2 winters. Thorne remained in Fort Dodge for 4 days, giving depositions and helping investigators understand the operation's methodology. The burned trailer and stolen pickup were recovered, both processed for evidence that might help identify the perpetrators. Security footage from a truck stop 30 miles away showed several individuals matching descriptions Thorne provided, fueling a multi-state manhunt. But Burl Fenner and his closest associates had vanished, probably anticipating that eventually their operation would be discovered and maintaining escape plans for exactly this scenario. The story broke regionally within a week, news outlets reporting on the highway horror house and the trucker who'd escaped a murder operation disguised as storm shelter. Thorne gave one interview to a transportation industry magazine, feeling obligated to warn other drivers about the specific tactics he'd encountered. But he refused most media requests, uncomfortable with being labeled a hero when he felt like someone who'd simply survived through luck and desperate improvisation. His burned trailer represented a total loss, but insurance coverage and company understanding meant he wasn't held financially responsible. They assigned him a new trailer and gave him 2 weeks off to recover physically and mentally before returning to work. When he finally climbed back into a cab and started hauling freight again, Thorne found that his relationship with the road had fundamentally changed. Every rest area became a potential threat, every offer of shelter during storms carried suspicion, and every empty building made him wonder what might be hidden in its basement. The investigation into the Callahan livestock auction operation consumed the better part of 3 months, with forensic teams working through frozen ground to recover remains and piece together the full scope of what Burl Fenner had orchestrated. Thorne received weekly updates from the lead investigator, a state patrol sergeant who'd made it his personal mission to ensure every victim was identified and every perpetrator was brought to justice. The numbers grew worse with each call. 14 confirmed victims, with 3 more suspected based on personal effects that couldn't be definitively matched to missing persons reports. The oldest remains dated back nearly 4 years, suggesting the operation had been running much longer than initial estimates indicated. The victims came from across the Midwest trucking community. Independent owner-operators like Thorne, company drivers hauling everything from produce to machinery, even a livestock hauler who'd been making the same route for 15 years before disappearing during a February blizzard. Their families had filed missing persons reports, hired private investigators, and spent years wondering what had happened to their loved ones. Now they had answers, but the answers brought no comfort. Their fathers and mothers and brothers and sisters had been murdered for cargo that was already insured, killed to protect a criminal enterprise that existed solely because winter storms created opportunities to prey on isolated travelers. Thorne attended 3 of the funerals, feeling obligated to represent the trucking community and to bear witness to the human cost of what he'd discovered. The services were heartbreaking. Families finally receiving closure after years of uncertainty but struggling to comprehend the brutality of how their loved ones had died. At one funeral in Nebraska, the victim's daughter approached Thorne with a question that would haunt him for years. Did he suffer? In the basement with the carbon monoxide, did he know what was happening? Thorne had no answer that would ease her pain, no words that could make the truth less horrible. He'd settled for honesty delivered as gently as possible. I think it happened quickly, and I think he believed he'd found shelter. That's the best I can offer. The manhunt for Burl Fenner and his accomplices expanded to include federal agencies when evidence revealed the operation had been fencing stolen cargo through interstate networks. The FBI classified it as organized crime with possible connections to larger trafficking operations, and suddenly what had seemed like a regional horror story became part of a national investigation into highway predation. Thorne gave testimony to federal prosecutors, walked them through every detail of his experience, and provided insights into trucker psychology that helped them understand how the operation had been so successful for so long. Drivers are independent by nature, Thorne explained during one deposition. We're used to solving our own problems, handling emergencies without outside help. That self-reliance makes us vulnerable to situations where asking for help seems like admitting weakness. Burl Fenner exploited that perfectly. He offered shelter during storms, positioned his facility as salvation rather than threat, and by the time drivers realized the danger, they were already trapped. The prosecutors nodded, taking notes, but Thorne wondered if they truly understood. You had to live the isolation of long-haul trucking to comprehend how seductive shelter could be when you were fighting a blizzard at 3 a.m., with 100 miles between you and the nearest town. The stolen pickup Thorne had used to escape yielded crucial evidence. Fingerprints matched 2 individuals with extensive criminal records in surrounding states, both with histories of theft and assault. One of them, a man named Derek Jessup, was arrested 3 weeks after the raid while trying to cross into Canada. He agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced charges, and his testimony painted a picture of an organization that had refined murder into systematic business. Burl Fenner had started the operation 4 years ago after inheriting the livestock auction property from a deceased relative. Initially, it had been simple cargo theft, intercepting stranded drivers and robbing them at gunpoint before releasing them with threats to keep quiet. But witnesses created problems, and within the first year Burl had made the decision to eliminate anyone who could identify the operation's participants. The basement CO system had been his innovation, a way to kill drivers that looked like accident or exposure rather than murder. The bodies were buried in the woods using equipment already on the property for agricultural purposes, and the personal effects were cataloged in case they had value or needed to be disposed of carefully. It was efficient, calculated, and utterly devoid of the chaos that characterized most violent crime. Burl had brought a business mindset to serial murder, optimizing every step of the process to minimize risk and maximize profit. Derek's cooperation led to 3 more arrests, but Burl Fenner himself remained at large. The FBI believed he'd fled to Mexico or possibly further south, using connections established through the cargo fencing operation. They'd frozen his financial assets, distributed wanted posters across North America, and assigned dedicated agents to the manhunt. But months passed without significant leads, and gradually the investigation shifted from active pursuit to monitoring and waiting for Burl to make a mistake. Thorne received periodic updates, each one confirming that the primary architect of the operation was still free and potentially capable of setting up similar operations elsewhere. The psychological impact on Thorne manifested in ways he hadn't anticipated. The first few weeks after returning to work, he'd been hypervigilant, checking and rechecking every rest area and truck stop, avoiding any facility that felt isolated or poorly maintained. But hypervigilance was exhausting, and gradually it faded into a different kind of awareness. He found himself unable to trust shelter during storms, preferring to risk weather exposure rather than enter buildings he couldn't fully evaluate. His CB radio conversations with other drivers took on a warning quality, sharing information about suspicious locations and encouraging colleagues to report anything unusual to authorities rather than handling it independently. Other truckers started reaching out to Thorne directly, treating him as an expert on highway predation despite his protests that he'd simply been lucky enough to escape. They asked questions about warning signs, tactics for evaluating whether a facility was safe, and what to do if they found themselves in situations similar to what he'd experienced. Thorne answered as best he could, but the truth was that no set of guidelines could account for every scenario. The criminals who preyed on truckers were adaptive, learning from each failure and adjusting their methods. What worked against Burl Fenner's operation might be useless against a different group using different tactics in a different region. 6 months after the incident, Thorne was hauling machinery parts through South Dakota when his CB radio crackled with a transmission that made his blood run cold. The voice was male, older, carrying a false reasonableness that triggered immediate recognition. "Attention, westbound commercial traffic. Storm conditions deteriorating rapidly. Drivers should seek shelter at nearest available facility. Emergency warming centers have been established at multiple locations." The phrasing was too similar to what he'd encountered at the Callahan auction, the same psychological approach of offering salvation while creating urgency. Thorne grabbed his cell phone and called the state patrol dispatch number he'd programmed after his Iowa experience. "This is Thorne Galloway, the driver from the Iowa livestock auction case. I'm on I-90 in South Dakota, mile marker 237, and I just heard a CB transmission that matches the tactics from that operation. Someone's directing drivers to emergency warming centers that may not be legitimate." The dispatcher took his information seriously, probably recognizing his name from the extensive media coverage. "Can you repeat the exact wording of the transmission?" Thorne did, noting the channel and approximate timestamp. "We'll investigate immediately," the dispatcher promised. "In the meantime, do not deviate from the interstate for any reason. If you need shelter, continue to the next commercial truck stop and wait there." Thorne agreed and spent the next hour monitoring CB traffic, listening for any repeat of the suspicious transmission. It never came again, but 3 other drivers reported hearing similar messages on different channels, all directing traffic toward what they described as suspicious-sounding facilities. The State Patrol launched investigations at each location, finding 2 that were legitimate emergency services, but 1 that matched the profile of Burl Fenner's operation. An abandoned grain elevator that had been modified with heating equipment and generator power, positioned to intercept drivers seeking shelter during the worsening storm. The facility was raided before anyone fell into the trap, and investigators found equipment and preparations that mirrored what Thorne had discovered in Iowa. But the people operating it had fled before law enforcement arrived, abandoning the site so quickly they'd left personal belongings and documentation behind. The FBI analyzed everything recovered and confirmed what Thorne had feared. This wasn't a copycat operation. It was the same organization, Burl Fenner's group, that had relocated and was attempting to continue their predatory business using refined tactics learned from their failure in Iowa. The discovery triggered a multi-state task force dedicated to identifying and shutting down similar operations before they could claim victims. Thorne was invited to participate as a consultant, providing insights into trucker behavior and psychology that helped law enforcement understand how to detect these facilities. He agreed reluctantly, knowing that involvement would consume time he needed for actual paying work, but feeling obligated to prevent others from experiencing what he'd survived. The task force meetings were held monthly, bringing together state patrol representatives, FBI agents, trucking industry advocates, and survivors like Thorne who could speak to the victim's perspective. The work was simultaneously frustrating and enlightening. Frustrating because they were always reactive, responding to reports of suspicious facilities rather than preventing them from being established. Enlightening because the scope of the problem was far larger than anyone had initially realized. Highway predation wasn't just Burl Fenner's operation. It was an ecosystem of criminal activity that exploited the trucking industry's isolation and independence. Some operations were opportunistic, robbing drivers who stopped at poorly chosen locations. Others were systematic, creating elaborate traps that mimicked legitimate services. A few were even more sinister, involving human trafficking or using truckers as unwitting couriers for contraband. Thorne's role in the task force evolved from consultant to advocate, representing the trucking community's perspective in discussions about policy and enforcement. He pushed for better communication systems that would allow drivers to report suspicious facilities in real time without compromising their safety. He advocated for mandatory safety inspections of any facility that advertised services to commercial drivers. And he worked with trucking companies to develop training programs that would help new drivers recognize predatory tactics before they became victims. The work was meaningful but emotionally draining, requiring him to revisit his trauma repeatedly while hearing similar stories from other survivors. 1 year after the Iowa incident, Thorne was hauling furniture through Nebraska when he stopped at a truck stop he'd been using for years. The facility was clean, well-maintained, and staffed by people who knew him by name. While fueling, another driver approached him, a younger man maybe 6 months out of CDL school. "Are you Thorne Galloway, the guy from Iowa?" Thorne confirmed his identity warily, never quite comfortable with the recognition his experience had brought. The younger driver extended his hand. "I want to thank you. I was hauling through Iowa last month during a storm, and I saw a facility advertising emergency shelter. Something about it felt wrong, and I remembered your story about checking for generator logs and looking for signs of preparation. I didn't stop, just pushed through to the next town. Found out later the place I'd almost stopped at was being investigated for suspicious activity." The gratitude was genuine, and Thorne felt a complicated mixture of pride and sorrow. Pride that his experience had protected someone else. Sorrow that such warnings were necessary in an industry that should have been regulated well enough to prevent predatory operations. "You trusted your instincts," Thorne said. "That's the most important survival skill any driver can develop. If something feels wrong, it probably is, and it's always better to risk weather exposure than to trust the wrong shelter." They talked for another 20 minutes, Thorne sharing practical advice that couldn't be found in any training manual: where to position your truck if you absolutely had to stop at an unknown facility, how to use CB radio to verify that other drivers had used a location successfully, what personal items to keep within reach in case you needed to abandon your vehicle quickly. The younger driver absorbed everything with the intensity of someone who understood how close he'd come to disaster. Before leaving, he asked a question that Thorne had been asked dozens of times by now. "Do you think they'll ever catch Burl Fenner?" Thorne's answer was honest and unsatisfying. "Eventually, maybe. But catching him doesn't solve the larger problem. There are other people running similar operations, some we know about and more we haven't discovered yet. The best we can do is stay alert, look out for each other, and report anything suspicious before someone else becomes a victim." That night, alone in his sleeper berth with the truck stop's lights creating patterns on the ceiling, Thorne allowed himself to consider something he usually avoided. What if he'd made different choices that night in Iowa? What if he'd decided to wait out the storm on the highway instead of seeking shelter? What if he'd entered the barn through a different door, or explored different sections, or failed to notice the driver's licenses in the basement? Any single variable changed, and he would have ended up in a forest grave with 13 other drivers, his family left wondering what had happened for years before getting answers that brought no peace. The thought experiments were pointless but irresistible, his mind trying to process trauma by examining alternative timelines. Sometimes he wondered if survival had been skill or just random luck, whether the decisions he'd made were genuinely smart or just happened to be the right choices in that specific scenario. A therapist he'd seen briefly had called it survivor's guilt, the irrational feeling that he didn't deserve to have escaped when so many others hadn't. Thorne had stopped going to therapy after a few sessions, uncomfortable with the emotional excavation it required, but the guilt remained a constant presence. 2 years after Iowa, the task force held a memorial service for the 14 confirmed victims of Burl Fenner's operation. The event was held in Des Moines, a central location accessible to families from across the Midwest. Thorne attended, along with representatives from trucking companies, law enforcement agencies, and transportation industry organizations. The service was dignified and painful, each victim's name read aloud while family members placed photographs on a memorial board. Thorne recognized faces from the driver's licenses he'd seen in the basement, now connected to stories about people who'd had families and dreams and futures that had been stolen for cargo worth less than most people's annual salary. After the service, several families approached Thorne to thank him for bringing their loved one's killers to justice, though the phrase rang hollow given that Burl Fenner remained free. One widow, a woman in her 70s whose husband had been hauling cattle feed for 40 years before disappearing, gripped Thorne's hand with surprising strength. He always said trucking was the safest job he'd ever had because he controlled his own destiny. Turns out, destiny wasn't his to control after all. The statement encapsulated something Thorne had been struggling to articulate. The illusion of control that made trucking attractive was exactly what made drivers vulnerable to predatory operations that understood how to exploit that independence. The memorial service marked a turning point in how Thorne thought about his experience. It wasn't just a personal trauma or even a criminal investigation. It was a symptom of systemic vulnerabilities in an industry that moved trillions of dollars of goods annually, but often treated drivers as expendable resources. The fact that Burl Fenner's operation had lasted 4 years before being discovered spoke to failures at multiple levels: law enforcement that didn't coordinate across jurisdictions, trucking companies that didn't adequately protect their drivers, communication systems that left people isolated during emergencies, and a cultural emphasis on independence that discouraged asking for help. Thorne began speaking at trucking industry conferences, using his platform to advocate for structural changes that would make operations like Burl Fenner's more difficult to establish. He pushed for mandatory GPS tracking that would alert companies when drivers deviated from planned routes for extended periods. He advocated for vetted networks of emergency shelters that drivers could trust during storms. He worked with technology companies to develop apps that would allow drivers to rate and review facilities in real time, creating crowdsourced safety information that could warn others about suspicious locations. Some of his proposals were implemented, others faced resistance from companies concerned about costs or drivers worried about privacy implications of increased monitoring. But slowly, incrementally, the industry began taking highway predation seriously as a safety issue rather than just a criminal justice problem. Training programs started including segments on recognizing predatory tactics. CB radio protocols were established for reporting suspicious facilities, and truck stops began installing panic buttons and emergency communication systems designed to help drivers summon help when they couldn't use standard phones or radios. 3 years after Iowa, Thorne was hauling electronics through Montana when his phone rang with a number he'd learned to recognize as the FBI task force coordinator. "We found him," the agent said without preamble. "Burl Fenner. Mexican authorities arrested him 2 days ago at a border crossing, trying to enter Guatemala with forged documentation. He's being extradited back to Iowa to face murder charges." The news should have brought satisfaction or closure, but Thorne felt only a hollow acknowledgement. Catching Burl wouldn't resurrect 14 dead drivers or restore the years their families had spent wondering and grieving. "What about his accomplices?" Thorne asked. "The people who were with him that night?" The agent's response was measured. "We've arrested 6 individuals connected to the operation. 3 more are still outstanding, including the woman you heard giving orders in the basement. We believe she's Burl's daughter, and she may be attempting to continue operations elsewhere using different methods. The investigation remains active." So, even with Burl in custody, the threat persisted, carried forward by people who'd learned the business and saw no reason to stop as long as vulnerable drivers and winter storms continued to exist. The trial took place 9 months later in an Iowa courthouse that was packed with family members, media representatives, and truckers who'd taken time off work to witness justice being served. Thorne testified for 3 days, walking the jury through every detail of his experience. The prosecution built their case methodically, using forensic evidence, victim testimony from families, and Derek Jessup's cooperation to establish the scope of Burl's operation. The defense attempted to argue that Burl was merely running a shelter service, and that any deaths were accidental results of carbon monoxide exposure rather than intentional murder. The jury didn't buy it. After 2 days of deliberation, they returned guilty verdicts on 14 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of theft, and various charges related to operating a criminal enterprise. The judge sentenced Burl Fenner to life in prison without possibility of parole, to be served consecutively for each murder count. It was the harshest sentence Iowa law allowed, and Burl showed no emotion as it was delivered, maintaining the same cold pragmatism he'd demonstrated when running his operation. Outside the courthouse, Thorne spoke briefly to assembled media, keeping his statement focused on the victims rather than the perpetrator. 14 people died because they trusted that shelter during a storm would be safe. They were fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters, experienced professionals who'd been driving for decades. They deserved to be remembered for their lives, not just their deaths, and their families deserved to know that their loved ones didn't die forgotten. He refused to answer questions about Burl Fenner, unwilling to give the man any more attention than he'd already received. But that night, alone in a motel room near the courthouse, Thorne allowed himself to feel something he'd been suppressing throughout the trial. Not satisfaction at the guilty verdict, but rage at the casual cruelty Burrell had displayed during testimony. The man had shown no remorse, no acknowledgement that he'd destroyed families and communities for cargo that insurance had already compensated. He'd testified about the operation like he was describing any business venture, discussing victims as assets and murders as risk mitigation. The dehumanization was complete and absolute, and it left Thorne wondering how many other people in the world operated with that same absence of empathy. 4 years after Iowa, Thorne was still driving, still hauling loads across the Midwest, still monitoring CB radio for suspicious transmissions that might indicate new predatory operations. The burns he'd suffered from the trailer fire had healed. The frostbite damage to his fingers had mostly resolved, and the psychological trauma had settled into something manageable, if never fully overcome. He'd learned to live with constant vigilance, accepting it as the price of staying safe in an industry where threats could materialize from any storm or isolated facility. The younger drivers who approached him at truck stops asked different questions now than they had in the immediate aftermath of Iowa. Instead of wanting to hear the story of his escape, they asked practical questions about risk assessment and decision-making. How do you evaluate whether a facility is safe? What signs indicate a location should be avoided? When is it better to risk weather exposure rather than trust uncertain shelter? Thorne answered each question thoroughly, treating it as an opportunity to pass along survival knowledge that might prevent future tragedies. He'd also started documenting his experiences in a series of articles for trucking industry publications, writing detailed analyses of predatory tactics, and providing concrete recommendations for both drivers and companies. The writing was therapeutic in ways he hadn't expected, forcing him to articulate lessons learned and organize them into frameworks that others could apply. One article about recognizing psychological manipulation tactics during emergencies had been reprinted by multiple safety organizations and incorporated into driver training programs across North America. But despite the advocacy work, the speaking engagements, and the satisfaction of knowing he'd prevented others from falling into similar traps, Thorne couldn't shake the fundamental unease that had settled over his relationship with the road. Every storm felt like a potential threat. Every isolated facility looked like a possible trap. And every CB radio transmission carried the possibility of being the bait that would lure another unsuspecting driver to their death. The industry he'd loved for 11 years before Iowa had become something darker and more complex, an ecosystem where commerce and predation coexisted in ways that were impossible to fully eliminate. 5 years after Iowa, on a frigid December night while hauling through South Dakota, Thorne's CB radio crackled with a transmission that proved his vigilance remained necessary. The voice was female, young, using phrasing that was almost identical to what Burl Fenner's operation had employed. Attention, eastbound traffic. Severe weather ahead. Emergency shelter available at the Morrison Grain Cooperative. Exit 214. Heated facilities and generator power available for stranded drivers. Thorne immediately recognized the pattern, offering specific amenities that drivers would find attractive, creating urgency through weather warnings, directing traffic to a facility that might not be what it claimed. He called the state patrol, provided the information, and monitored CB traffic to see if other drivers took the bait. 2 trucks reported exiting toward the Morrison facility, and Thorne made a decision that probably wasn't smart but felt necessary. He took the same exit, following at a distance, planning to observe whether the facility was legitimate or something more sinister. If it was legitimate, he'd apologize for the paranoia and move on. If it wasn't, He'd try to warn the other drivers before they made the same mistakes that had cost 14 people their lives in Iowa. The Morrison Grain Cooperative sat in darkness, except for a single light near what appeared to be the main office. The two trucks that had exited ahead of Thorne were parked in the lot, drivers presumably inside, seeking the promised shelter and generator power. Thorne stopped his truck 300 yards away, positioned so he could observe without being obvious, and watched. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then a vehicle appeared from behind the grain elevator, a pickup truck moving without headlights, approaching the parked commercial vehicles with deliberate purpose. Thorne grabbed his CB mic and broadcast on the emergency channel. Any drivers at Morrison Grain Cooperative, exit 214. You may be in danger. Multiple vehicles approaching your position. Pattern matches known criminal operation. Exit facility immediately and return to interstate. He watched through binoculars as the parked truck's lights came on, drivers receiving his warning. Both rigs started moving, pulling out of the lot and heading back toward the highway. The pickup truck that had been approaching stopped, and Thorne saw figures exit it, watching the departing trucks but not pursuing. He'd disrupted something, though whether it was a legitimate criminal operation or just a suspicious-looking situation remained unclear. State Patrol arrived within 30 minutes, investigated the Morrison facility, and found it abandoned with no evidence of recent activity. The pickup truck had disappeared before officers arrived, and the people Thorne had seen couldn't be identified or located. The investigation was inconclusive. Another suspicious incident that might have been a threat or might have been innocent circumstances misinterpreted through the lens of trauma and vigilance. But Thorne knew what he'd seen, recognized the pattern too clearly to dismiss it as coincidence. Burl Fenner was in prison, but his methods had been studied and were being replicated by others who understood the profitability of preying on isolated truckers during winter storms. The threat hadn't ended with arrests and convictions. It had evolved, adapted, learned from failures, and continued operating in the spaces where law enforcement presence was thin and driver vulnerability was high. That night, parked at a truck stop 50 miles from the Morrison incident, Thorne updated his personal database of suspicious facilities and tactics. He'd been maintaining this information for 5 years now, sharing it with law enforcement and industry organizations, watching as the list grew longer despite everyone's best efforts. Each entry represented a potential threat, a location or tactic that other drivers needed to know about. The work was endless and sometimes felt futile, like trying to empty an ocean with a bucket, but it was the only response Thorne knew how to make. The highway stretched ahead into darkness, carrying trucks that held everything American commerce required. And somewhere in that darkness, people still waited for opportunities created by storms and isolation, and the trust that drivers placed in signs and systems they assumed operated according to legitimate rules. Thorne drove carefully, watched constantly, and shared what he'd learned with anyone who would listen. Because the alternative was accepting that drivers would continue dying in the facilities that promised shelter but delivered murder, and acceptance meant complicity. Some nights, when CB radio static sounded almost like voices and storm clouds gathered on distant horizons, Thorne wondered if he'd spend the rest of his career looking over his shoulder, seeing threats in every shadow and danger in every unexpected transmission. The paranoia was exhausting, but it kept him alive, kept him alert to patterns that other drivers might miss until too late. And if that vigilance saved even one person from experiencing what he'd survived in Iowa, the exhaustion was worth it. The road didn't care about stories or trauma, or the lessons learned from survival. It just kept extending forward into darkness, indifferent to both predators and prey. Thorne drove through that darkness with eyes open and communication systems monitoring, knowing that somewhere out there, winter storms would create new opportunities for operations like Burl Fenner's. And when they did, He'd be watching, warning, doing whatever small part he could to make the highway safer for drivers who just wanted to deliver their loads and make it home to their families. The Callahan livestock auction sat abandoned now, its buildings demolished after the investigation concluded and the property seized through criminal asset forfeiture. But the empty space where it had stood remained a memorial to the 14 drivers who'd died there, a reminder that evil could flourish in the most ordinary-seeming places when isolation and opportunity aligned. Thorne passed that exit sometimes during runs through Iowa, always noting the absence where the facility had been, always remembering the night he'd sought shelter and found nightmare instead. And sometimes, late at night when exhaustion made thoughts drift into dark territories, Thorne wondered about the accomplices who'd never been caught. Burl's daughter still operating somewhere with knowledge and methods learned from years of systematic murder. The others who'd been in that basement, searching for him while discussing standard protocol with the casual efficiency of business professionals. They were still out there, possibly setting up new operations, definitely sharing what they'd learned with others who saw value in predatory tactics. The highway was an ecosystem, Thorne had learned, and ecosystems always contained predators alongside their prey. The only question was whether the prey stayed alert enough to recognize danger before stepping into traps that promised shelter but delivered death. For Thorne, that alertness had become permanent, a lens through which he viewed every facility and every storm. Some drivers thought he was paranoid, overcautious to the point of interfering with efficient operation. But those drivers hadn't seen what he'd seen, hadn't felt metal gates swinging in impossible synchronization or smelled carbon monoxide accumulating in basement shadows. The work continued, the vigilance remained, and somewhere in America's heartland, winter storms kept falling on highways where drivers sought shelter from cold that could kill as surely as any human predator. Thorne drove through those storms with lessons learned and warnings ready, knowing that his survival had purchased an obligation to protect others from threats they might not recognize until escape became impossible. It wasn't the career he'd imagined when he'd first climbed into a truck 11 years ago, but it was the one he had, and he'd learned to carry its weight alongside the cargo that still needed hauling through darkness toward distant destinations.